Hey there, welcome to Bedtime Chills. Tonight, we've got 3 hours of creepy, scary stories paired with rain sounds to help you drift off to sleep. Can we hit 300 likes on this video? Show some love, share with friends, and subscribe to join our eerie crew. Where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below. Get cozy and prepare for a chilling night of relaxation. I was working at a sports bar in the morning, and a big, dirty fella sat down in my section. He had shoulder-length wild hair and dirty, torn clothing, typical loony garb. But I'm a good waitress, and I didn't plan on treating him any differently than any other customer. I greeted him, and was instantly hit with the smell of garbage. I grew up neglected and abused, which is important for a few reasons, some of which come into play later. I know what it's like to be judged, and I empathize and overcompensate when dealing with someone I think has also been wrongfully judged. My parents were creepy hoarders, so the smell of garbage, especially garbage and body odor together, gives me anxiety attacks. Because of the abuse and other trauma, I have severe PTSD. This sports bar was the last job I was able to hold, which means I'm always on high alert and hypersensitive to my surroundings and possible threats. I constantly think in terms of defense, especially concerning my home. Even though the smell of this man skyrocketed my anxiety, I treated him well. I figured he was down on his luck. He came out all-you-can-eat taco bar day and stayed for 5 hours. I assumed he hadn't eaten much lately, which struck a personal chord with me because our parents didn't feed us, and we often went days without food. I felt so sorry for him, so I went above and beyond when serving him. He obviously appreciated it, and he left, nothing unusual. He returned the next week and requested me. This time, he brought some emails he had printed out between him and his ex, and asked if I could read them and explain some of the things his ex said since I was a girl. I told him I would read them while I wasn't working, which I had no intention of doing. I took them and shoved them in my purse. From the emails, I saw his name was Steve. He later asked what days and shifts I worked, and I lied through my teeth. He started asking other personal questions too. I was used to this. I'd waited tables for 8 years at that point and dealt with my fair share of creeps, so I had a whole fabricated life story ready to deter any funny business. Things like how my boyfriend is a giant with anger issues, that I have nosy neighbors, etc. I remember that the only true thing I ever told him was that my sister worked at Subway, and I accidentally mentioned her name. I remember this vividly because I had a very strong gut feeling that I shouldn't say it. I wish I had listened to that feeling. A week later, during one of my night shifts, Steve came in, and he was furious. He demanded to know why I wasn't working when I said I would be. I told him I had traded a lot of shifts recently. Steve got super close to me and exclaimed that I had better be there next time, then left. A cook told me he had seen that guy sleeping in his car in the parking lot that morning, and he had seen the same car parked there several times when he left at night. He knew it was the same car because it was filled with trash. Steve came back in after last call and told me he wanted to place an order, but I said it was too late. He went to the bathroom. I watched for him to leave, but he never did. At this point, I felt a panic attack building. I told the bartender manager what was going on, and he and the bouncer found Steve standing on the toilet in the stall. They dragged him out and told him he could never come back. I told my boyfriend about it, so when he picked me up, he brought 2 friends, and I discreetly hid my face and disguised myself when I left, checking the mirrors to see if we were being followed. Steve never came back, and I ended up quitting shortly after. Eventually, my boyfriend and I broke up. I kept our apartment and had my sister move in. A few months later, things took a turn for the worse. I started dating my girlfriend, who is from a small town, and she wanted to take a weekend trip back home. When we got back, one of the window panes was busted in a multi-paned window. I asked my sister about it, and she hadn't noticed. She hadn't left the house all weekend and didn't hear glass breaking or anything suspicious. This didn't feel like a break-in attempt, and the more we thought about it, the scarier it became. We were dead broke, and there was nothing inside worth stealing. Trust me, I've tried, and it's obvious no matter which window you look through. I think defensively, so all the windows have blinds, but there are a few gaps in them from the cats. I've looked through these gaps multiple times to be completely aware of what can and cannot be seen. Also, I put long screws in all the window frames so they can't be opened more than 4 to 6 inches. The window pane wasn't broken in, it was pried out, meaning they knew someone was home and didn't want to be heard. It was the only night in over a year that I left town. I didn't put it on Facebook, and I only told a few good friends. Neither my sister nor I have cars, so you can't look at the driveway and see who's home. The next night, we heard the neighbors' dogs barking and growling and footsteps in the yard. I grabbed the gun, went to the living room next to the yard, and listened, thinking to myself, be smart, is this 2 feet or 4? The second I realized it was bipedal, I started flipping the lights on and off rhythmically to make the person think we were signaling our neighbor. That made them leave. A sign it wasn't a break-in attempt was that you don't return to a house you failed to break into the day before. My sister and I got tasers and wasp spray. It's cheaper than pepper spray and sprays farther, because I don't have a CNC and my sister won't touch a gun. The rest of the week was quiet, and my sister was now armed. So that weekend, my girlfriend and I decided to go out. We got into a stupid fight that night, and when she dropped me off, I threw $20 in her car and said something snarky like, here's my half of the tab, and went inside. She noticed when she was a few blocks away and texted she was going to come give it back, but I told her not to. She knocked, but I didn't answer because I was mad. I heard footsteps come up to my bedroom window, and I waited for her to knock on the window so I could yell that I told her not to come by, but she just walked off. She texted to say she tucked the $20 in the screen door, so I got up to grab it, and there was nothing there. I told her it wasn't there and asked if it could have fallen out, and she said it wasn't possible. Then I asked why she walked to my window, and she hadn't. This meant whoever saw her leave the money had to be 50 feet or less from the door. It had only been 3 minutes tops from when she dropped it off to when I checked, and the only place it could have been was in our backyard. It also means whoever walked up to my window knew my girlfriend was there to see me and knew which room was mine. A week later, we heard footsteps in the yard again. I did the same routine, grabbed the gun, stood in the living room, then started with the lights. Then I had an idea. This person needs to think they can be seen, so I started flipping the switch every time I heard a step. Once they noticed, they started running, so I ran to look out the peephole and saw a big guy with wild hair running down the alley. Even though I didn't get a great look, the general outline resembled Steve. So I started looking for the emails he gave me. Like I said, I'm always on high alert, and he raised concern. The second I noticed his full name was on the emails, I decided to keep them. I got his last name and searched his public record, then pulled up his most recent mugshot and asked my sister if she had seen the man before. Her face went ghost white. She said yes, he smelled like garbage, and that made her anxious too. He came into her job, Subway, a few times, but every time he came in, he asked her lots of questions. She said she will never forget the creepy, menacing smile he plastered on his face the second she told him her name and the feeling of pure fear it gave her. She rides her bike to and from work, so I'm betting he followed her home. One thing became painfully clear. He didn't hurt my girlfriend when she left the money. He didn't touch my sister when she rode her bike home. This was about me. The second she told me this, I called the cops. I gave them the emails and told them everything I knew, down to the name of the cook I knew could describe his car. They found his car within a week. It was abandoned by the lake. It was full of trash, a few personal belongings, and pages on pages of his crazy thoughts and intentions. There were hundreds of pages about me and what he thought he knew about me, my sister, a checklist of all the subways he checked to find her, what he learned from her, the layout of our house, my girlfriend's info, and, the most disturbing, his very sexually charged plan to keep me alive while he cut me up and ate me. The plan was to break in, kill my sister, and wait for me to come home. Then he was going to cut off a piece of me a day and make me watch while he ate it and engaged in sexual activities. In less than 24 hours, the cops found his body in the lake. I had PTSD before this happened, and so did my sister. This event made it so much worse for us. My sister can't work either now, and we are both in the disability process. I debated posting this for a long time. I don't like thinking or talking about it, and it gives me panic attacks sometimes. It literally took me 6 hours to write it all out. But I decided it's a story worth telling. I'll never get over it if I keep avoiding it, and maybe, hopefully, it will help save someone else's life. So be kind with the comments. This story happened to my mom's friend in Korea about 10 years ago. Every time I hear it, I still get chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the day. One day, while coming home from running errands with her daughter, she entered the elevator in her building. As she got on, she noticed a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat who kept his head low so she couldn't see his face. She immediately felt uneasy and made her daughter stand beside her, furthest from the man. Her discomfort grew when she pressed the button for her floor and noticed there was no other lit number. On top of that, she saw that he was carrying something wrapped in newspaper close to his side. Panic began to set in, and she decided to pull out her cell phone and pretend she was calling her husband, who was actually at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you get the door for me?" making it seem as though her husband was waiting at home. When the elevator reached her floor, she lived around the 12th floor. She quickly got off, grabbed her daughter, and hurried down the hallway to her apartment. She noticed that the man had also gotten off and was slowly following her. At her door, she banged on it and shouted, "Hey, Yobo, husband, I'm home. Please open the door," and pretended her husband was coming to answer. Seeing this, the man in the yellow raincoat started to walk back towards the elevator. When he seemed far enough away, my mom's friend quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode panel, which is commonly used to enter homes in Korea, and began frantically punching in her key code. However, the buttons made sounds, alerting the man that no one was going to answer the door for her, so he turned around and started running back toward her. At this point, my mom's friend was nearly screaming. When she finally got the door open, she threw her daughter inside first. As she got in herself, she saw that the man was inches from the door, but she managed to shut and lock it before he could force it open. Looking through the peephole, she saw the man walking away, heading back toward the elevator. Several months later, my mom's friend was watching the news when there was coverage of the capture of a serial killer named Ji-young Chol, who had murdered many prostitutes. She told my mom she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the all-too-familiar yellow raincoat and hat that he was wearing when he was apprehended. When I was a teenager, I was goth, black hair, black clothes, black makeup, even a pair of combat boots. My friends and I, in typical goth fashion, hung out at the local cemetery. We started going as a joke, but soon discovered we liked the peas we found there. That all changed one night. My friend called to see if I wanted to hang out, and I did. None of our other friends were available. They were either working or recovering from partying the night before. So, we were on our own. My friend picked me up, and we drove to the cemetery. We were hanging out, smoking cigarettes, and chatting about the latest issues she was having with her boyfriend when we noticed, at the top of the hill we were on, about 100 feet away, a bonfire had been lit. You have to understand that this cemetery is about a block off the campus of a major university, and it's not uncommon for college students to go there to party. My friend and I sighed, knowing that we would have to get going soon. It was illegal to be in the cemetery after dark, and we knew the police would show up because some individuals had decided they needed a bonfire. We decided to finish our cigarettes and then take off. Just then, the most horrible stench began wafting down the hill from the direction of the bonfire. My friend gagged and covered her mouth. I groaned and said, "What the heck?" My friend shook her head, saying, "I don't know what they're doing. Let's just leave." We got in the car, and one of us suggested, though I honestly don't remember who, maybe we should just go up and see what they're doing? My stomach turned, and a cold shiver went through my body. My friend must have had the same feeling because, at the same time, we both said, "No, we should leave." My friend turned on the car, switched on her headlights, put the car in reverse, and looked over her shoulder before starting to back up. I was still looking up the hill when a figure stepped in front of the bonfire. I could only see a silhouette, but I was sure whoever it was watching us. A feeling of terror hit me, and I said, "Go, go," getting louder and more panicked with each word. My friend glanced back up the hill for a second, and just as the figure took a step towards us, she slammed on the gas and peeled out, going in reverse down the hill. She rammed the gear shift into drive, and we were out. We didn't say anything for a while until she said, "What on earth were they burning?" I shook my head. "I don't know." She dropped me off at home, and I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and went out to the kitchen. My mom was there, drinking her morning coffee, and I joined her. We talked about her job for a bit when she suddenly said, "Did you hear what happened last night?" I shrugged and said no. I had just gotten up. She told me that a woman she worked with had been kidnapped from the parking garage. "Oh my God," I said. "Did they find her?" "Yes, but too late," she replied. "Whoever took her had assaulted and murdered her. They found her this morning up in the cemetery. He had tried to dispose of her body in a bonfire." I froze. My brain was racing, and the realization slowly crept in. That's what that smell was. Needless to say, I never hung out at the cemetery at night again. I think back to our decision to leave instead of investigating the fire. That one decision could have changed everything. The bag lady. I have always had an innate fear of the night. Not so much the dark, but the night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on until one night when I decided to go with a buddy of mine to a baseball game and got stuck at a light at 2 a.m. after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night the game went into extra innings, so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off until well after 1 a.m. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light was one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green right when you decide to just run it. Of course, I pulled up right as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was around and it was closing in on 2 a.m. on a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase "character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window to my left and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact, and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case and braced myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would be just an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me, though I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her, and she motioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I imagined pushing too hard on the window button and it coming all the way down. I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she did not seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said, "My boyfriend hurt me. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and of indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20-plus years on the street, or she was a 60-something-year-old who had lived a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked worn out by life, not just by a boyfriend. But there was something about her delivery. It was robotic and seemed practiced, as if she was disconnected from the moment, that made my skin crawl. After a brief, about a second, debate on whether I should help, I told her that I had to get home and could not give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and repeated the same thing, "My boyfriend hurt me. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" This time I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride and told her I had a curfew and needed to get home. She leaned in a third time and began her statement again, "My boyfriend hurt me." At this point, the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started rolling forward, muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, then looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since: "You made the right decision." Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do or if there were people waiting to jump in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in, but that encounter has haunted me ever since and confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I, both female, would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruidoso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than traveling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM55. It's a remote, tiny 2-lane highway. We loved those types of roads, up until that day. This part of New Mexico is flat and desolate desert. You can see for miles, and there is virtually nothing except dirt and rock between towns, and towns can be miles apart. So we were on NM55 going north. After a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck up ahead of us going the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to get uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should turn around rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about a half-mile away from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway, but his truck was still pointed in the direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely, this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we passed him, we noticed a few things. One, there was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged man who never took his eyes off us, and 2, he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us. But he never got too close. He would get within a few car lengths and then drop back a little, only to speed back up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and we hadn't told anyone about our great idea to take this detour. We checked our cell phones, and neither one had signal, typical for remote New Mexico, but scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road with more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town, Mountainair. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. It was going very, very slowly, maybe 20 miles per hour, if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour, which wasn't typical for us on these 55 miles per hour highways, and we blew by the old pickup. As we passed it, we saw that it was another middle-aged man, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and followed it. As we watched all this, we could see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed. For the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us. We watched for obstacles in the road. We truly thought old, beat-up pickup guy had set up a trap in the road and that our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We talked about driving into the fields. We were in an SUV. But this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered. So, we stayed on the highway. By now, the white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie, and he stayed right on our bumper. The old, beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The white pickup inched closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent that he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got to within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles per hour and edging up to 90 miles per hour. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of was that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, then we'd be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road. Should we risk it? Could we speed through the desert and make it to safety in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument, and it pointed towards a road on the left. At that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came up on the blue pickup, we saw that the plate said U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and then looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to Mountainair and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police, and they said they would keep an eye on things. This area is very near Belen, New Mexico, which is where Tara Calico was abducted. It's also about 100 miles from Elephant Butte, New Mexico, which is where David Parker Ray had his secret torture laboratory. We didn't put all that together until later. Even though David Parker Ray had died by the time this happened to us, we do believe that there are others out there like him. And whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Or maybe we came into meth lab territory. But since this happened on an actual highway rather than a backcountry road, I tend to discount the meth lab theory. Whatever is going on out there, it's not good. I deliver pizza and had been having a really busy night, non-stop back and forth, without any time to even pause and take a leak. I'd been so busy that I wasn't really thinking about bathroom breaks. But we were also going through a bit of a heat wave in our area, so I'd been drinking copious amounts of water. All of a sudden, as I was driving to this particular delivery, the urge to go hit me. Things went from 0 to 60 in an instant. Thankfully, I was close to the customer, so I could get this one over with quickly. Or so I thought. I pulled up to the house, and it was an area I'd delivered to before, so I could immediately see that something wasn't right. All the lights were off in the house, not even the glow of a television or anything. It was extra apparent because the streetlight closest to the door happened to be out of order. On top of it all, the block was dead quiet. This is a big university area, and obviously, there aren't many student renters in July, but there had to be at least one person, because someone ordered this pizza. Maybe they just liked sitting in the dark or were out back in the yard, whatever. I just didn't want to get out of my car and knock on a quiet house in the middle of the night, around 9:30 p.m., without first checking that I had the correct address and the customer was inside. It was scorching that night, even after sundown. My car's AC is a joke, and the piping hot pizzas don't help things much, so I try to open the car door as infrequently as possible to keep any cool air in. I called the number the customer provided, and the voice on the other end said, kind of brusquely and out of breath, "Yeah." I just tried to keep it clear and concise. "Hey, it's your pizza out front, but there doesn't appear to be anybody home?" The customer replied, still gasping for air, "Yeah, I'm not home." I had to pee so badly by that point that I was much less patient than I'd otherwise be with a customer right out of the gate. "Well, then we're going to have to cancel the order, because I've arrived in the stated delivery window, and you were supposed to pay in cash, so I don't know what to tell you. Plan ahead next time." I instantly regretted letting my bladder do the talking for me as the voice on the other end came through more clearly as a young, bubbly, and very distraught girl who couldn't have been older than 20 or 25. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I was running down the street, so I could barely hear you," she cried. "I just switched you out of my AirPods. Is that better? Sorry, I completely lost track of time at work, but I knew you were coming, that's why I'm literally running home right now. Please don't leave, I'm starving and I don't have a car. Seriously, please don't leave. 5 minutes tops, okay? I know what it's like to be hungry, running late, and having no car but not living near any restaurants." Plus, when I heard her voice, I began to remember more specifically having delivered to this place a couple of times before, and she'd always been perfectly nice. Now I felt bad for snapping at her. I tried to walk it back while simultaneously looking out my window for potential spots to pee. No, my bad. I'm letting the heat get to me, and it's not your fault. No need to rush. See you when you get here." I hung up and, while surveying the street, was starting to think I was really out of luck. All the other houses had people in them and were close together, so there were no clumps of trees or out-of-the-way patches of land or anything. Of course, I had just tossed my empty water bottle at the last delivery because I'm an idiot. Finally, I decided it was escalating to the point of an emergency, and the safest bet was to use a bush in front of the woman's house. She wasn't home. The street light was out, so no one would see me. The people who were home were inside. My car was parked across the street, and we're a small shop that doesn't wear uniforms, so if someone did spot me, they'd have no way to connect me to my employer. Animals pee outside all the time. Humans are animals. This is fine. I scurried over to the tallest bush in her front yard. She didn't really have much of a yard, more just a walkway lined with bushes and flowers that ran adjacent to her front door. The biggest cluster of bushes, the only one where I could be sure there would be no visible splatter on the side of the house, was about 4 feet from her door. I looked both ways, unzipped, and let fly. After the initial millisecond of relief, I noticed the sound was way off, more like urinating on something solid than something leafy. I started panicking, thinking I aimed wrong. But once I start, I can't stop midstream, so I kept squinting into the darkness to see if maybe I was hitting a key rock or something and could just move a few inches over. Instead, all of a sudden, I heard a much more concerning noise, a deep voice exclaiming, "What the heck?" Before I could turn around, assuming I'd been caught by a neighbor, a man came leaping out of the bushes. He blew by me, brushing my unwelcome spray off him as he did. He spit pretty emphatically on the ground, so I think I might have hit him right in the face. I didn't see where he went after a few paces, but though this next part is kind of a blur, I do think I remember hearing a car screech out from a bit further away after a minute. I'd gained some night vision by that point, so I was able to make out his height, build, and outfit, but only the most general details of each. I was in such shock that I didn't even put myself away. I just stood there trying to figure out what had happened. The reality was so terrifying that my mind refused to accept it and impulsively searched for a reasonable explanation that could make everything okay. I thought, could these bushes lead to some backyard area and just look like they were against the house? Could they have been obscuring an open window? My inner voice was desperately screaming that man was wearing a hoodie in 90-degree weather. That was a dangerous man. You're in a bad situation. But the very idea that I was within inches of a guy who would be hiding in bushes at all, let alone in front of a young woman's house at night, just wasn't something I was ready to grapple with yet. I was coping by not coping. My fight or flight response totally failed me at that point because my dumb self did the absolute last thing I should have done and approached the bushes to try and validate this. There must have been a good reason for a man in a hoodie to be behind these bushes in the middle of the night theory. So I walked over to the side, turned on my phone flashlight, and tried to peer around the line of shrubbery. Pro tip, as scary as things may look in the dark, seeing them with a single beam of your flashlight can sometimes make it even worse. That's why I saw the bag. There was a tattered drawstring bag sitting behind the bushes, slightly splashed with urine. But I was in such a daze from shock that I groped around for it thinking, see? This is it. This will explain why he was back here. It explained it. Once I maneuvered it over and pulled it open, I saw a sharp knife, a roll of duct tape, and a bottle of pills. The delusions officially broke at that point, and all the adrenaline, endorphins, and self-preservation instincts that had been suppressed kicked in 10 times over. I became whatever the opposite of dazed is. More laser-focused than I have ever been in my life, with one singular goal: get back to my car. I dropped the bag, dashed across the street, got in my car, and slammed the pedal to the floor before the door was even all the way closed. I went as far as I could, as fast as I could, until I hit a red light. Then, I pulled off to the side and realized I shouldn't be driving more than necessary in the condition I was in. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour drugstore and took a breath. I was finally calm and coherent enough to zip up and formulate a plan of action. My first lucid thought was, who do I call first, the police or the girl whose house that was? I thought about it for what couldn't have really been more than 10 seconds, but felt like an hour, and decided, okay, I am in my lot car with the engine running. If trouble starts, I can drive away. I know something's up, she might not. She needs to know not to keep walking in that direction. But as I was dialing her number, it occurred to me, what if there was no girl? I thought I remembered delivering to that house before, but what if I was wrong? What if the girl on the phone was just a decoy to get me there to rob me, or worse? Every pizza delivery person has seen the Evil Genius documentary by now, so I thought she called me all out of breath. She wasn't home. The whole thing was off. Can't risk it. I'll start with the police. I called 911 and the operator was very helpful in keeping me calm because I was a complete wreck by this point. He kept assuring me that someone would be there soon. I kept telling them they had to get there before the girl did, but I was trying to express 3 thoughts at once, damaging my own credibility. It came out more as, "You've got to save this girl because he wasn't after me. I was just delivering a pizza. Unless they were after me, in which case there might not be a girl. But I talked to one on the phone, so then you should find that girl because they used her to lure me there. But if she's real, she doesn't know about the guy, who is also real, and there could be more guys if there's actually a girl. And you know what? Even if there isn't a girl, there might actually be more guys. I only checked one part of the bushes, so I don't actually know. But we'll know which guy is the one I saw because I urinated on him, you know. I didn't mean to. This was back when I thought the girl was real but not home. But she might be real, so you really need to find her if she is because the guy was real." Finally, they basically just asked me to stop talking and stay on the line. But that was when I saw an incoming call from the customer. I couldn't answer it without disrupting my 911 call, so I just ignored it. But then she sent me a text like, "Hey, I'm here. Don't see you?" I told 911 she was there, and they said officers were only minutes away. But who knows how long that meant? Especially after I'd given such a scattered account of the events in my panic. I just felt overwhelmed with guilt because my rational mind said the odds of her being a decoy girl for some large scam targeting pizza delivery people were low, and the odds of her being the intended victim of a predator were high. So I put my 911 call on mute, where I could hear them but they couldn't hear me, and turned back, heart absolutely pounding out of my chest, compulsively muttering, "Damn, damn, 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 damn," the entire way. Then I took 911 off mute and told them I had returned to look for the girl. They weren't happy about that, but I saw her meandering past the parked cars in the street looking to see if one was mine, and I waved her down, flashing my brights. She bounced over to the window of my car, happy-go-lucky. I figured that was a good sign that she wasn't in on whatever this was. But I was just so scared to be back in the general area and not know what had just happened or what was going to happen. I kept whispering, "Get in. Get in." And she was like, "Get it? Huh? Oh. You want me to get the pizza from the back?" I didn't want to make the same mistake with her that I had made with 911, so instead of trying to tell the whole story, I stuck to the bare basic facts. There was a man in your bushes. I'm on the phone with the police. I don't know where he is right now. Please get in the car so we can lock the doors. I was barely able to get even those sentences out, and I was shaking like I had 10 cups of black coffee. I held up my phone with 911 on the call screen to verify it for her. I thought that was why she got in the car with no further explanation, but it turns out that wasn't entirely it. "You still there? Is she with you? Are you safe? Is anyone else there?" 911 kept checking in, not knowing who the third party I was talking to was. I reassured them, and we drove, more cautiously this time, to a location 911 instructed us to wait to speak with police after they cleared the area. I didn't actually have to do much after that. The police came pretty soon after. A police car met us. I gave a statement telling them everything I observed, and she went to go speak to more officers in more detail than they needed me for. It turns out the reason she got right into a strange pizza delivery guy's car without probing any deeper into my story is that she knew who the man was right away from my description. She had an abusive ex-boyfriend who was apparently psychotic enough that he immediately came to mind from hearing, "There's a guy in your bushes." She later called us to thank me and insist on leaving a huge tip. I wasn't there when the call came in, so the kid who answered didn't know to refuse to accept the money. But the manager already promised the next time we see her we can load her up with enough one free pie cards to last a lifetime. Easily the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, on the job or off. I don't get the chance to tell the story much because I try to avoid sharing it with anyone who could possibly know the girl or know the event. But I'm still not the same since. Even though I know he didn't have anything to do with me directly, this truly shook me to my core. Always change your locks when you buy a new house. So, this happened in 2013 when I was 17. My family was looking at this house, and the owner showed up to talk with my parents. He seemed like a nice older man who had built the house himself. It was a pretty nice 2-story house overlooking a river. Anyway, I was standing back, watching everyone talk, and as the owner was talking and laughing, there was a break in the conversation where he turned away from my parents. His expression completely and instantly changed from happy to the most sinister and hateful scowl I've ever seen. I don't think he noticed me watching. It probably appeared that I was on my phone since my head was down. As soon as he turned back, he instantly went back to smiling. It was so creepy and honestly made me feel sick. I told my mom, who said it was weird, but maybe he was just awkward. So, we got the house. We moved in, and the next weekend my family went to church, but I didn't feel like going, so they all left me at home. It was Sunday morning, around 11 a.m., when I heard really loud banging outside. It was rhythmic and coming from the side of the house. I was on the other side of the house on the second floor. Honestly, my dumb self thought it might be the wind. It was stormy that day, and didn't think much of it. It stopped after about 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, I heard walking around downstairs, chairs moving, kitchen cabinets opening, and the fridge opening. I immediately and quietly locked my door, grabbed my baseball bat, and called 911. While I told them my address, I texted my mom to let her know that someone was in the house and that I had called 911. At that point, the 911 operator said that someone was 10 minutes out. I told her this because I heard steps walking towards the stairs. Basically, the house was so thin I could track where he was. At this time, my mom responded that she was on her way. She was 30 minutes away. So here was a 17-year-old, 5 feet 2 inches, 100 pounds girl hunkered in her room, fully aware that if he came in, he'd overpower me and take the bat. I was terrified. I heard him walk down the hallway towards my door. I saw the handle turn and stop. It was locked. I heard him stand there. He didn't move. I could hear his breathing. It felt like forever, but I think it was about 10 seconds. I heard him turn and go back down. I heard the back door open and shut. About 3 minutes later, the police pulled up. The 911 operator asked me if I could let them in or if they needed to force entry. I knew he had left, so I let them in. No one was there, no sign of forced entry, nothing. When my mom arrived, she looked at my stepdad and asked if he had changed the locks. He hadn't. I think the creepiest part, and what really validated my story, was that my mom had just vacuumed the hallway. There were shoe prints that were larger than anyone in our house, and the police hadn't been up there. The print stopped just outside my room. He died about a year after that. Please don't forget to change your locks. This happened about 10 years ago when I was 11 and my brother was only 7. My parents had recently split, and we lived with our mom. Jonathan and I were home alone in the mornings and had to get ourselves to school while she was at work. It was a bit of a hike, 30 minutes if we went the safe way, through quiet neighborhoods, so we often opted to cross at the nearest busy intersection to shave a good 10 to 15 minutes off our walk. On such days, we would almost always encounter this bizarre crossing guard. He was pretty weird, a bit slow, but always nice enough. Nothing that really warranted any reaction other than, what a strange old guy. He had a habit of asking me and my brother our names and where we went to school every time we saw him. Being a really paranoid kid after going through the stress of our parents' separation, I warned Jonathan against ever giving out our real names and told him to make one up instead. Really, we shouldn't have said anything, but we were kids, and it turned into a game. Over time, we thought it was pretty funny that he never seemed to remember us, so the names we gave him became more and more elaborate and obviously made up. We always said we went to other countries for school and that we had planes to catch, silly things like that. The guy totally went along with it, and we attributed it to the fact that he probably wasn't all there mentally. We always had a good laugh about it. This routine went on for a good 3 or 4 months without changing until one day the guy stopped asking questions. He just stood there like a statue, watched us pass, and muttered, "Have a good day, kiddos." It was a little unsettling. I didn't like his demeanor, but then again, I didn't really like any older man's demeanor after witnessing my dad having a nervous breakdown. I just shook it off and we continued our way. When we got to the neighborhood, we walked through to get to the path that led us to school. I noticed that we were being followed by a big, white van with a blue light on top. It had been parked at the top of the street, and as soon as we were about halfway down, it started up and drove very slowly in our direction. I kept looking over my shoulder because it made me nervous, and after a few checks, it sped up and cut us off by driving onto somebody's lawn. I immediately grabbed Jonathan's hand and told him that he had to stay beside me no matter what. I noticed that the van had police written on the side, but the logo looked a bit off. There was a woman in the front seat in a uniform, but it looked a bit strange too. She rolled down the window, gave us a huge smile, and said, "Hey kiddos, I just want to ask you a few questions. Please step up to the vehicle." My head started to spin a little bit because the van did say police and she was wearing a uniform. I had always been instructed to trust police officers. My gut was telling me that things weren't quite right, but my automatic reaction was to obey. I took my brother and walked slowly up to the window. The officer then opened the door and pulled a clipboard up to her lap. "May I have your names, address, and phone number, please?" she asked, giving us an even bigger, warmer smile than before. Jonathan looked up at me, then at the officer, and blurted out, "And my name's Jonathan, and this is my sister Amanda. We're going to Yo's school." I squeezed his hand really hard in an effort to get him to be quiet. He stopped talking. The officer was writing it down and nodding and asked us to continue. She sensed my hesitation and said, "It's okay, honey, I'm with the police. We've had reports that a crossing guard is asking kids questions on their way to school, and we just want to know if you've experienced anything, unusual." The way she was speaking didn't sit well with me. Her uniform looked tacky, there was only one light on her van, she had cut us off on our walk, she asked too many questions, and she addressed us as kiddos in a way that reminded me too much of the crossing guard. The fact that she brought him up made my gut churn with paranoia. Still, though, if she was a cop, I thought I might get in a lot of trouble if I lied to her. I stammered out an address that my family had lived at a few years back. I hoped that the fact I had once lived there would make it a half-truth so my face wouldn't completely betray me. She could tell and started to get a bit stern. "You shouldn't tell fibs to the police. Didn't your mom and dad ever tell you that? Here you too, it's starting to snow. You must be cold. Why don't you get in and I'll give you a ride the rest of the way to school. You can tell me everything while you warm up." Jonathan was really eager to jump in because he had been standing there shivering for a while now. He started to move forward, but I yanked him back and mustered up enough courage to say, "I'm sorry, but we're going to be late. I can't take rides from strangers, we'll be okay." She was not satisfied with my response and started to look angry. She started her van. I didn't think an officer should be upset with a kid who knew better than to take rides from people they didn't know. It ran contrary to everything I had ever been taught. She unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward, and that was the final straw. I picked my brother up and ran as fast as I could into the backyard of the house around which the officer was parked. I burst through their gate, tore through the yard, and hoisted my brother over the back fence. I went through backyards the rest of the way to school. We were definitely late, but I made sure my brother was safe in class and immediately went and told the principal. He made an announcement about it and contacted the police. I later learned through my mom that the police had not sent anyone out to investigate the crossing guard. In fact, they didn't know anything about him at all. They couldn't confirm anything about my story on their end. The day after the incident, we noticed that the weird crossing guard was gone. He never showed up again, nor was he replaced with anybody else. The police never found anybody, and, fortunately, Jonathan and I never had any issues for the rest of our elementary school years. Sometimes, it's not the customers that are the scary parts of overnight shifts. To give some context, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people and primarily exists to cater to the demand from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7 so the college students can impulse buy whatever they like. Another big draw in the area is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often passed through to get to the city, many places keep their gas prices slightly lower than those in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights at a gas station/liquor store while taking part-time classes in college, mostly online so they wouldn't interfere with my availability for a full-time job. The store where I worked had only one person working the overnight shift for a long time. Despite complaints from many, especially women, about the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best customers in a liquor store/gas station in the middle of the night, the store continued with just one person on duty. The owner's hand was forced one night before I started working there when a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only to have a man approach her from behind, pressing a gun into her back and demanding her money. She complied, and fortunately, he let her go. She ran back into the store, sobbing hysterically. Although the police arrived shortly after, the man was never found. I personally preferred having two people on duty, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The nights went by much quicker with someone else there, and it was nice that the person I usually closed with and I got along so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and was only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she worked 2 nights a week with either Josh or me. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or me 2 nights a week. Dixie was friendly and fun to be around, but she didn't particularly like the job or want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but since it was only 1 night a week, he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was different. He worked 5 days a week, just like Josh and me, but they never seemed to pair him with the same person more than once a week. Nobody seemed to like working with him. Nick was a bit off from the start. He was one of those people who would tell you his entire life story as soon as he met you, sharing very personal details that made others uncomfortable. One topic he frequently discussed was the strain on his marriage. Apparently, he had a severe drinking and drug problem for a long time. While he managed to switch from hard drugs to marijuana, he still struggled to control his drinking. Although he was hard to be around, you get used to some people being a bit sketchy in this kind of job. I had been working there for almost 3 months when Nick's stories took a disturbing turn. He began telling people that he was diagnosed as a psychopath when he was younger and had to take several pills daily to avoid becoming violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand with mental illness. I've always struggled with anxiety and depression myself, and without medication, I wouldn't be harming anyone, but I'd probably be hospitalized. As creepy as it was, I assured him that many people need medication for various illnesses and that, as long as you stick to it and are honest with medical professionals, you can still lead a normal life. He seemed pleased with this response, and soon after, the conversation moved to other topics. He was especially cheerful and nice to me for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medication and feeling good about it. I always responded enthusiastically, but I'm sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished he would stop talking to me about it and leave me alone. Josh had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter at the time, so he couldn't help but view us younger women through the lens of what his daughter might face when she was our age. He often went out of his way to end my conversations with Nick quickly, which I appreciated. It wasn't long before Nick began discussing why he was diagnosed, rather than how his medication was working. I won't go into details here, but much of it was very violent and sexual. I repeatedly told him I didn't want to hear about that, and he would act like he understood and change the subject, only to return to it about an hour later. When I confided in Dixie, she said she would handle it and spoke to her friend, who was the manager who had asked her to work there. The manager couldn't do much since I seemed to be the only one Nick talked to about these things, but she told me to come to her again if I ever felt uncomfortable. The situation grew increasingly tense for everyone working with Nick after he was talked by the manager. Soon, 2 other women working the night shift reported similar comments from him to the manager. I was questioned and confirmed that the statements made by the women were similar to things Nick had said to me. Nick was given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, he would go on rants about how people were only reporting him because they didn't like him. I assume he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither Josh nor I had any intention of telling him. He got so angry at one point that he was practically in tears, saying how lucky those jerks were that he was on his medication and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that his shift ended, and as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat with him. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had come extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit that needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking the drink coolers. It was true that it was easier to do at night when there were a lot fewer customers, so it was annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't remember the time that Josh went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it when the bell chimed, signaling someone had come in. I threw out a good evening and said I'd be right there since anyone who came in that late usually only wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for the gas in cash. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it, there was Nick, not looking at me but leaning next to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It turned out he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of alcohol that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I considered for about 30 seconds whether I should actually go or if I should run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young, fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old woman. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, he turned toward me. That's when I noticed immediately that there was something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me, with nothing in his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring. "He leave you here alone?" It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler and asked if he wanted me to go get him. Again, he just stared at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said, I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was creeping me out. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he grinned at me, and in a disgusting, almost singing voice, he said, "You're lying, you are alone." He laughed and took a step toward me but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point, I should have run to Josh. I should have called for him, anything, but I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I had never felt an actual danger around him before. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow, stumbling steps, telling me to come here. I just want to talk. I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was particularly amusing and laughed loudly enough that Josh later told me was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks and see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself in between Nick and me. They didn't even say anything, just stared each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick stared blankly for a moment, then scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about this situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there and he had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corralling Nick to the door. Completely unexpectedly, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or just really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face. Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down as he smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area, I'm not sure which, and used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the police as we heard this sickening crack behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie of one or an actual car wreck when something hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through, and it turns white all around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do this time. I ran to the register and grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door and huddling on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time he noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so hard. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address because just as I got up to look at a receipt to see what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor, and she told me that officers were already on the way and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at the part of the window he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through, though. From that hole, he could reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole he had just formed and said something that I'm sobbing right now, even thinking about. In that horrible, sing-song voice that he used the first time I talked to him that night, he said in such a happy tone, "They're never going to find you too." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was terrified as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backward from the impact. Josh yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors at the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain as he realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We both realized at once that he had actually planned this out to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me time to slam the backroom door shut and lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick reached it. He must have heard me crying because he kept calling out my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted, and that he would make sure that I died before I even felt the pain if I opened the door. He then started stabbing the door, screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go get it, so we had no idea how long until the police arrived. The door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last long against his body slams and offered no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here. That my dog would never know why I didn't come home. That I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life. That all the plans for the future my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There were no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both dropped to the ground when a gunshot went off once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence, then a voice rang out, asking if anyone was there. We weren't sure if we should say anything, then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things aside in front of the door, opening it just enough to put his head out. It seemed like all the breath just left him. He opened the door and went out into the store, relief all over him. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer were, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police arrived because, though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said he would have run after him, but with the state that the store was in, he was scared that someone in there could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a blur. Josh and I were sitting on the floor, hugging each other, when the police arrived. The EMT had called dispatch and told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got to go home and came in to see my dog's body wiggling excitedly, proudly displaying his flamingo toy for me as a welcome home gift. Nick was found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he had been using to drink so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently, the reason that he had come after us was that he thought that the reason Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so he could call the owner again, and this time, the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening texts and phone calls she had been receiving. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target, and he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh nor I called the owner or even a manager over his comments that night though maybe we should have. It was disturbing what he was saying in hindsight, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things at that point that it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months, and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent toward anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check before they were hired, so it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. He took a plea deal so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and he would instead go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm writing this story now, other than the other stories on this subreddit inspiring me, is that I got a call 2 weeks ago notifying me that, as long as there are no setbacks to his health status, Nick is set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he said he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh nor I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I have switched to going to college completely online and in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I don't think he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I read so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I'd be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had pretty intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I have ever heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you too. Nick, if it was true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I don't feel safe, especially at night. I don't believe in God, but I pray to anyone who's listening that we never meet again. This just happened a few minutes ago, so I'm still a bit upset about it. I thought it would help to write it down to at least let it out. I'm with my husband on our honeymoon in Hawaii. We're a gay couple. Today was our first full day here, and due to sea conditions, our late night snorkeling with manta rays was canceled. To compensate, we decided to go for dinner and drinks. We had dinner at a really nice brewery, and since they closed early, we thought about going to a bar for some late night drinks. We Googled a bar that seemed like a good idea. It claimed to be gay friendly. Even though the walk there wasn't very scenic, through what seemed to be a very industrial area, the bar seemed okay, so we agreed to have a couple of drinks. After a few terrible karaoke performances, a drunk guy who seemed to be in his late 40s approached us and told us that he had just had a great martini. He asked if we were gay and what we were doing there. My husband is extremely polite and always keen to make new friends, so he engaged in conversation. This guy said his name was Joe, but we could call him Joey. He was from Vermont, which he later changed to Quebec, and was married to a guy named Anthony, who was back in their room because he worked the next day. Supposedly, he ran 3 companies. After a bit, and several signals from me to my husband to end the conversation and go back to our hotel, the conversation became really strange. Joey started commenting on our looks, first saying that I wasn't attractive, then saying I was very handsome, and then telling my husband that he was beautiful, and so on. He asked our names 5 times. To my horror, my husband kept answering. Then he started saying that as an American, he wasn't welcome in Mexico, my own country and our current home, because he'd be put in prison. He constantly grabbed my arm or my husband's arm as he told these bizarre stories, making our skin crawl. A few moments later, after asking for our names again, to which neither of us answered, he began insisting that my husband looked German and must be German. As he said this, he leaned into me so uncomfortably that I had to stand up, grab my husband, and say, "We are leaving now." We told him we had to leave because we needed to wake up early, though I wonder why we gave him excuses. As we said goodbye, he tried to kiss my husband. My husband and I were enraged and shouted, "What the heck?" while making our way to the exit. As we were leaving, we heard the guy tell my husband, "You're very handsome," then run up and smack my husband on the backside. At that moment, all we could think about was leaving the place, but now I wish I had gone back and said something to have him removed from the bar. Anyway, this guy almost completely ruined our first day of honeymoon. We're back safely at the hotel, but I can't stop thinking about how creepy this man was. An added note, my husband believes this guy was pretending to be drunk and that this might be his modus operandi. Now that I think about it, he didn't smell like alcohol, and his drink looked a lot like plain water. So, creepy guy who pretended to be drunk to hit on younger men and almost ruined our first day of honeymoon by trying to kiss my husband and smack him, let's never meet again. This happened a few years ago when I graduated college and took my first real job in the city. I had moved back in with my parents after college, and the daily commute into the city was really wearing on me. I was finally getting paid enough to live by myself and wanted a place that was close to the hip neighborhoods but still within my price range and not dangerous. Safe. Accessible. Affordable. After searching for a while, I felt like it was a game of pick two, but then I happened upon a small community managed by a reputable company. It was gated and nestled between two residential neighborhoods, surrounded by trees, seemed very safe by Atlanta standards, and seemed to meet all of my criteria. The rent wasn't quite where I wanted, but I figured I could live with it because I was exhausted. As the leasing agent showed me around, I understood why they were charging less for this place. The buildings definitely had some age on them. They looked like they were built in the 60s. I remember being shown the unit and thinking it was kind of drab. The thing that really stood out the first time I saw my soon-to-be bedroom was the large square door on the side of the room facing the outside. The leasing agent described it as a walk-in closet, which I found to be a bit of a stretch. The opening was small because it had to accommodate a sloped ceiling, just to give you an idea of how much horizontal wall space there was. You definitely had to crouch a lot, or crawl, to get in there, but once inside, it opened up a bit. I made a dumb joke about being John Malkovich that the agent didn't understand. Honestly, though, I was a single guy and didn't have much stuff, so I didn't care. I signed the lease, the longest term they offered, because moving is a hassle, and moved in. As I suspected, the closet remained empty after the move. I was able to fit my clothing in a dresser. I'm a programmer, and my job lets me wear whatever I want, so I don't exactly keep suits on hand or anything like that. The first time I opened the closet was after I moved in because the internet guy was looking around for jacks. When I opened it up, I smelled something faint. I thought it smelled like marijuana, but I couldn't quite place it. I chalked it up to musk and or insulation. As the weeks rolled on, my curiosity about the closet peaked a little bit. Every person that I brought over found it to be a really interesting feature of the apartment. One day when I woke up after a late night of drinking, I saw the door to the closet was slightly ajar. The handle was pretty old, and I figured it must have come loose. When you live in an old building, you get used to that kind of thing, some creaks and groans along with the normal noise from the neighbors. Sometimes, though, when I was in bed or around the apartment, I would hear sounds that I thought were a little odd. Footsteps that seemed oddly placed based on my knowledge of the building layout. Nothing too strange though. While I was out on my patio one day, my apartment faced the woods surrounding the complex. I noticed that the gate I thought surrounded the entire property stopped when the woods got too dense, about 40 feet from my apartment. It didn't look like anybody could possibly get through unscathed, but it still set me on edge. It was as if my subconscious was piecing things together that didn't seem quite right and tugging at the edges of my conscious mind. I used to lock my bedroom door when I went to sleep at night as a precaution in case of a home invasion. I started to leave it open. I kind of chalked it up to something silly, like running up the stairs after turning the lights out in a basement. Still, though, before I went to sleep every night, I would think about the little square door a few feet from my bed that had all that space. No amount of logical reasoning would set me at ease. The idea of opening the closet filled me with a sense of dread that I refused to acknowledge because it seemed so childish. Eventually, enough was enough. I decided the door was coming off its hinges and I was installing a night light. I waited until broad daylight to muster up the courage to open the closet. Even then, I took a knife from the kitchen and held it to my side just in case. When I opened the closet, it was completely empty. I caught something in the corner, almost pushed into the carpet was a red mini-bic lighter. I flipped out. There was no way that was there before. I broke my lease the same day and went to stay at a hotel. I tried filing a police report, but they said there wasn't enough evidence and the management wouldn't let me out of my lease without paying all the fines. I didn't care. There was no way I was spending another second in that apartment. I even hired movers to come and haul my stuff. To this day, it still freaks me out a little bit because there was no big reveal that justified my freak out. When I think about somebody crawling in and out of that closet while I'm asleep, it sets the hairs on my neck on end. Outside my window. I grew up on a small farm in Innisfil, Ontario. This farm was about a 15-minute drive from any village or town. The house my family lived in was actually a very historic building. It had been built in the late 1800s and was made of large stones. The first floor had massive ceilings, which also meant the windows were huge, roughly 7 feet high. Because it was an old house, the layout was kind of unusual. All of the rooms were easily connected, meaning no hallways. When my stepbrother moved out, I was able to take his room on the first floor. I was the only one downstairs at night. My other brother and parents had rooms on the second floor. Most nights were creepy, to say the least. My father was an antique collector, so everything in the house was even more unsettling at night. Sleeping in that room as a young teenager really made me tense on some nights. Animals were able to get into the walls and scratch around. Sometimes a car would drive up the very long driveway and just sit there with the lights on. I am guessing it was robbers checking the place out, seeing if anyone was there, or other teens thinking of something to do. Birds would hit the windows some nights and scare me, coyotes howling close to the window. The list of scary things goes on, but there is one summer night I will never forget. In Ontario, on a hot and humid summer night, it is very difficult to sleep without air movement. So, I had my bedroom window wide open. It had a mesh screen to keep the insects out, but I had my shutters wide open as well. If you have ever been up reading with the light on, you will notice that a bright light from inside a room means pitch black darkness outside. So, there I was, reading a book with my light on and the window open. I heard some rustling outside, but I always heard that every night from animals. Living in the country, one does not suspect a random person to be out and about, so the clear thought was animals, as always. Not this time. As I lay on my bed, I heard a sudden, raspy woman's voice. I don't mean raspy from a sore throat, I mean raspy from smoking and drinking heavily. All she said was, "Hey, you." I wish there were a way to better explain the terror that shot through my mind. Not only was there someone outside my window looking at me in my boxers, but I could not see her face. It was so dark. I must have jumped through the roof because I have never felt that fear before or since. There was absolutely no way I was going to answer her, so I bolted out of my room, turning the corner to run up to my parents' room. My mom was already running down the stairs. She is a light sleeper and had heard the woman, with my stepdad, following behind her. They rushed outside while I ran up to my brother's room. My mom said they never found anyone around, and they would have seen a car driving away because it was such a long driveway. I then slept with that window closed until we moved out. I even closed the shutters so nothing could see in and used a fan to circulate some air. I know it was just a woman's voice, but knowing someone was there looking at me for I don't know how long was a terrifying experience, especially as there was no reason for someone to be wandering through the country late at night. There were a couple of other scary occurrences on that farm, but this was by far the most terrifying. The car in the alley. This will require some explanation. Several years ago, I started a project that I have been working on ever since. I went around interviewing professional criminals to ask them what they did for a living, why they did it, and how they felt about it, along with a battery of other questions. Being young and ambitious, I plowed onward with little regard for the potential risks involved. During that time, I came into contact with gang members, hitmen, extortionists, and numerous other unsavory characters, but one memory in particular still gives me chills. I was at a point in my work where I was interviewing women and men involved in the sex trade. It started with independent sex workers and expanded to include escort agencies and pimps. I was looking around for my first pimp to interview when I was contacted by a sex worker I had already spoken to. The woman was an Australian living in the US, a petite blonde who happened to be quite eccentric but willing to talk. She said that a friend of hers, a Dominican woman, had a pimp who said he wouldn't mind being interviewed. One of the most important skills I learned during those days was discretion and screening people before I talked to them. Ironically, this skill was taught to me by independent escorts who had to do that kind of screening to avoid police or clients. I asked her about the guy in a roundabout way and got a rough description: a big, forceful black man who used intimidation on most of the women under his employ, as well as several potential competitors. She went on to explain that she often had to feed her Dominican friend because her pimp would take all of her money and wouldn't give her a dime, even though she was starving. Asking around among women in the profession whom I had come to trust, a picture soon emerged of an abusive and dangerous man who was violent towards other pimps as well as his women. However, he was known for his vanity, and an interview with me was something he felt entitled to, given his self-importance. With some trepidation, I went to this meeting, but on a tip from my friend, I timed my arrival during a period when his associated muscle would be out around town and busy with other things. I started off the night without any particular worries. I'm a pretty big man myself, a former athlete and lifelong martial artist. I had lived rough before and had few qualms about getting physical if I needed to. As foolish as this attitude is, knowing that you're walking into situations where people have guns and aren't afraid to use them, the way you carry yourself around those kinds of people seems to deter guns being pulled. I drove into town, spoke with Kelly at an apartment she was staying at, then made my way over to the apartment where this pimp was. As I made my way there, I felt like eyes were boring into my back. I didn't look directly, as eye contact in such areas can lead to a stare down, which leads to all kinds of trouble, but I checked a passing reflection. Across the street was a car parked in an alley, just sitting there. I knew without looking that there was someone inside, and this feeling of being watched had a kind of malevolence that put me on edge even after everything I had already seen and dealt with. I brushed it aside as some boogeyman or other I had yet to interview and made my way inside and upstairs. The apartment was the kind of temporary shelter common among traveling pimps and hustlers on the go, cheap enough to be in a rough area to avoid scrutiny, but big enough to be cozy and house anything from sex workers to hired muscle to stashes of contraband. I was greeted with surprising warmth by the big man whose employees were all out working that night. He had dressed for the occasion, not just with strong cologne and a blocky suit, but also with a cheap smile and half-remembered manners from some long-forgotten upbringing. He made his best attempt to be charming, and I humored him, complimenting his attire and business savvy and inviting him to speak at length in response to each question. He went on about a number of topics, from his status in the game to how much money he made, to how fine his workers were, and finally to how he was muscling on some other rackets to diversify his business. I should have paid more attention to that last one. My questions answered, I thanked him for his time, but only after we enjoyed a few laughs and a bit of wine. I'm pretty good at charming even people I despise. I made my way out of the building, enriched by my first conversation with a pimp and with a good bit of information I was still processing. As I rounded the corner, I felt it again, the intense stare from the car still in the alley across the street. I pushed it out of my mind and just kept walking. It was about a day or two later that we figured he must be dead. I got the call from the Australian woman that her friend was staying over at her place terrified. When she had come back from working that night, the apartment had been broken into, and from outside, she could hear it being ransacked. She fled back to the hotel room where she had serviced her clients and waited to be contacted. After some time, she went back and found that the place had been broken into, completely ransacked, and there was no trace of her pimp. When I got that call, I went numb because everything came together. The talk of how this guy was muscling into other rackets, the car parked across the street casing the place, and the careful timing of waiting until all of this guy's backup was out of the picture. I had preceded the killers in the alley by only a narrow margin, and it was only due to luck that I hadn't walked into the place in the middle of a murder. This guy was not the only pimp I interviewed, and he certainly wasn't representative of all of his compatriots, but he sticks out in my mind to this day. I'm delivering packages. I live at home with my family in a peaceful, private neighborhood. Or more accurately, just a street, really. It's a gated community, and we are pretty secluded up on a hill. Now, if you want to get in but don't know the code, all you really have to do is wait for someone to go through the gate before you. Not the best security measure, I know. But it's a very quiet community, everyone knows each other, and gets along, so it's usually only the odd curious explorer or lost delivery person. Oh, and I'm a 19-year-old woman, by the way, in case you were wondering. This happened a few weeks ago, earlier in the summer. It was just a usual morning, with everyone else out at work or otherwise occupied, and I was taking advantage of the opportunity to sleep in. By about 10 a.m., I was up and letting the dogs outside when I heard a knock at the door. We have a glass front door. I now decidedly dislike those, and I could see what certainly looked to be a delivery person at the door. And he could see I was home, so I couldn't avoid answering. Glass doors have a way of working both ways, I guess. My mom is always ordering things, so I figured it was something I had to sign for, or the person would have just left it there and gone. I walked over and opened the door, more concerned with the fact that I had just rolled out of bed than anything else. There in the doorway was a skinny, white man of about 30 with sandyish hair, wearing a brown uniform. A collared work shirt and matching brown pants, like UPS. However, I noticed there was no logo on the shirt. In fact, no letters, names, or writing whatsoever anywhere, which was strange. By that point, I had actually focused in on the man himself, and that's when it got weird. This man just instantly gave me the creeps. What I noticed first were his eyes. He didn't look normal, honestly. His eyes were meeting mine, and he took a moment to speak. When he did, I almost wanted to crawl out of my skin. He had this raspy, slow voice and sounded like he wasn't even paying attention to what he was saying. "I'm here delivering packages," he said. He looked behind me as he spoke, not at me. Through the doorway into the house. "What's your name?" I gave him our last name. "Oh yeah. I think I've got a package for our last name. Is there someone else, like your mom or dad, here who can sign for this? I mean, if you're alone, though. I bet you could too." He looked hopeful. He didn't even bother to ask how old I was. Also, I believe for UPS you don't need to be 18 to sign anyway. And normally, he'd produce a name and check to confirm it if anything. This man was fishing. Definitely sensing something was off, but before I could respond, I noticed he didn't have a package. I froze. In fact, He didn't even have a clipboard or any paper of any kind. But he did have a fanny pack on his belt. I knew that wasn't very unusual in itself, but I noticed it looked really out of place. It was beige and didn't go with his uniform at all. In fact, the whole outfit looked more like someone just trying to copy a UPS uniform. When he did meet my gaze, he looked at me like I was a piece of meat. Before he could notice me hesitate, I said, "Oh yeah. My parents are both just asleep. I'll go get one of them to sign. They need to wake up anyway." And that did it. That set something off in this man's head. That's when he seemed to lose it. He started mumbling incoherently, muttering something like, "I've made a mistake, this is the wrong house," and stopped making eye contact completely. He was pacing a bit, as if fighting some internal battle over whether or not to stay. He completely dropped the act by then, and we both knew his story was totally unbelievable, but he didn't seem to care. He started walking away, and I slammed the door and locked it. Then, feeling a bit safer, I watched through the window as he ran out to the street, where I noticed a large, white, unmarked van. One of those with two big doors in the back and no windows on the sides. I wanted to get all the information I could about this man, so as he sped down the street, I looked at the van and got a chill. There were no license plates. This was creepy enough, but the worst part actually came afterward. I called my dad and told him about the creepy encounter. He said to lock all the doors until he got home. Once he did, I gave him a full description, and my dad looked really worried, which I didn't understand. I hadn't been hurt, and the man was gone, so the threat was over, right? As I mentioned, our neighborhood is very close, and most of the neighbors are close family friends. My dad emailed them all a description of what had happened. I went about my day until dinner time when he told me he had something to share. He and my mom hadn't told me before so as not to freak me out. Apparently, a few months earlier, the neighbors directly next to us had also had an incident. They have two teenage girls, one a few years younger than myself. The youngest one had been home alone one day by the pool when she looked inside and saw someone walking around their house. Terrified, she had apparently gone around the side of the house into her room and hid, and called either the police, her parents, or both, I'm not sure of all the details, and waited while she saw this man walking around inside the house. There are actually windows in some of the interior walls, so she could see from her room into the kitchen, family room, etc. He walked around, opening doors and looking in, but apparently there was money and jewelry lying around that he could have easily taken. That wasn't what he was looking for. She ended up hiding out of sight until she heard the front door close and went out to check if he had gone. She saw him drive away in the car he left in. It was her mother who replied to my dad's email. She gave a description of the man who had entered their home. He had been white, wearing a brown uniform, and drove off in a white van. Had I known about it before, I don't know if I'd have been able to stay so calm about that man talking to me at the door. We filed a report that day. The police officer who came to our house seemed convinced it was a would-be robber. I don't think so. Something was off about that man. He was too socially awkward, seemed like he didn't know how or didn't care to interact with other people. He looked way too pleased when I answered the door and when he saw the empty house inside. And he had walked right past valuables flying out in the open when he had entered the neighbor's house. And who knows what could have been in that fanny pack. Or tools. I truly believe there are some people out there who are just not right. I'm so glad I didn't let him know I was home alone. When my now ex-husband and I were between moving from one apartment to another, we decided to save some money by staying with my brother, his wife, and kids for the summer. My husband and brother were both union carpenters working on the same job at the time, so the convenience was a huge factor. I was not working, as we had just had our daughter, who was only a few months old. My sister-in-law, who also stayed home with the children, decided to run some errands with her girls, leaving me and my infant alone at home. They lived in a nice, newer neighborhood in a small town that was at least 45 minutes from the nearest large city. It is a safe community where the worst thing that happens is kids getting into trouble. There hadn't been anything beyond traffic violations and accidents for well over 50 years. Anyway, the way their house was arranged, the great room and kitchen were in the back of the house. It was a 2-story, and the living area was at the front, with a stairway separating them. I heard what sounded like rattling and got up to look out the window, thinking my sister-in-law was home and needed help carrying in bags, but I found nothing. I unlocked the door because my husband, brother, and sister-in-law were due home shortly. I was in the great room, watching television and holding my sleeping baby when I heard something almost like a scream. I happened to be watching a scary movie, so I thought maybe I had just heard something in the background of the movie and not, in fact, anything real. I ignored it and went back to my movie. Less than half an hour later, my brother and husband walked in the front door with my sister-in-law right behind, followed by the sound of sirens screaming down their road. Their neighborhood was wooded, and they lived on a dead end, so something was clearly going on. My brother started talking really fast, saying he and my husband had pulled up to overhear his next-door neighbor on the phone out front, covered in blood, talking to 911, saying, "They are both dead, hurry." He said the neighbor then got off the phone and dry heat on his sidewalk, not more than 50 feet from my brother and husband. After a good hour or two, we found out that while I had heard the rustling sound out my front window and then what sounded like a scream, someone had walked into the neighbor's house and had violently murdered the wife of my brother's neighbor and her stepson, who was only 9 or 10 at the time. The husband had come home from work to find their mutilated bodies and a scene that would make any horror movie seem fake strewn through his house. The following information is from police sources, provided by a detective working the case who happened to know my brother and is graphic to some extent. Apparently, the unknown killer had tried their door, found it unlocked, and went into their home. Once inside, he went upstairs and found the stepmom, China, in the master bedroom putting clothes away. The stepson was down the hall in his room. The murderer then used some form of knife to start slashing and hacking at China, spraying her blood all over the room and down the hall as she tried to escape. They believe she must have yelled for her stepson to run and call the police because they found him near the front entry of the house. When the father got home, he found his wife's body near the bottom of the stairs, a blood trail, and some of her organs strewn from the master bedroom upstairs down the hall and down the stairs, with her handprints on the stepson's doorway, as if she were reaching out for help. The son was found in the entry, having been trying to escape. He was missing fingernails from digging them into the flooring. Blood was everywhere. The front door was not totally ajar, but slightly opened, with the young child's handprint, as if he had almost made it outside before the killer reached him. Additionally, investigators said that the wife had been assaulted in a violent manner with what was believed to be a broomstick. Also, my brother kept a small pop-up camper outside, and in addition to the knife used to stab the victims, the chunk of 2x4 behind the camper's wheel was used to bludgeon them and left in the house, covered in their blood. The police speculate, because of the noises I heard, that the killer had first tried my brother's door, hearing the television on but finding it locked. He then walked past his camper, the wheels with the wood were closest to the garage, and picked up the chunk of wood while walking next door. That door was unlocked, and the murder ensued. I had nightmares and couldn't sleep for weeks, with the media camped outside our house and the neighbors for well over a month. They never found out who killed them or really any evidence that was usable to find the killer, and I believe had I walked in and unlocked that door even minutes earlier than I chose to, it would have been myself and my infant who were murdered. It still scares me when I think of it. Edit. I had a couple of people question whether the man was outside when he called 911 or inside by his son, as one of the local media outlets reported. I can say quite certainly that he was outside because I watched the whole thing from my porch, which was only from my yard to his, right next door. One other poster included a link to a memorial page created by China's mom, which has numerous articles with quotes from others backing up what I say. Also, there was a lot of speculation about whether her husband was involved because earlier in the day, I had left to run an errand and saw him drive by me on what should have been his lunch. But when the police checked his work, he never checked out for lunch, and when I returned from my errand less than 20 minutes later, he was leaving his driveway and waved at me. Also, his reaction after his initial bout of throwing up and calling 911 was very odd for someone whose family was murdered. There is a rumor that the police had evidence of his involvement, but because of the lack of murders in the area ever, they botched the evidence and couldn't use it. I do not know if that is true or not, just hearsay. Anyway, if anyone has questions regarding any of the details, what it was like afterward, and how the media and police were around, feel free to PM me. I will gladly answer any questions. It was a scary and very sad experience. My art teacher fell in love with my dad. When I was about 10 years old, I took private art lessons. I was really into drawing at the time, and my parents were always pretty good about letting me explore my talents and interests as long as I gave it a good try and didn't just get bored after a couple of sessions. So, I started taking lessons with a woman who was a friend of a family friend. The actual lessons weren't that weird, and I didn't get much of a creepy vibe from her myself. I thought it was strange that her name was the same as my mother's, just spelled differently, but that wasn't really something she had control over. For several months, I went to her house for lessons or worked on a painting. If I had an assignment for art class, we would work on that. One day, I was picked up from school by my mother instead of riding the bus to daycare. At the time, my mother worked, so I was very confused by her being at the office to pick me up. The car ride home was mostly silent, and I started to get suspicious. I asked if everything was okay. I assumed one of my pets had died. She told me everything was fine, but my father was going to talk to me about it when he got home. For a couple of hours after I got home, I just sat and waited for my dad. I had a very real fear that I was in trouble. My mother usually disciplined me, but if I did something really bad, it was always turned over to my dad. Finally, he walked in, and I got my most somber expression ready. He sat down and told me that I would not be going to art lessons anymore. I was heartbroken, and he hesitated before explaining. Apparently, my father had been with the police because he had to answer some questions regarding my art teacher. She had tried to pick me up from school earlier that day. The office staff asked her for her name, which matched my mother's, and were about to call me up when one of the other teachers told them she wasn't my mother. My mom had volunteered at my school a lot before she started working full-time, so the teacher immediately recognized that this woman wasn't my mother and didn't have clearance to pick me up. She then called my dad's workplace and told him that she had me with her and that my mother had been dealt with. She wouldn't say what she did, but kept telling him that she loved him and that we could be a wonderful family. He stayed on the phone with her for a while before telling her she was right and that he would be over after work to talk about everything. Thankfully, that teacher at my school thought it was odd and called my emergency contact numbers. The secretary at my dad's work gave him the message. Now that he knew I was safe, he called my mom and confirmed she was okay before calling the cops. Everything ended up fine in the end. She got the help she needed, and as far as I know, she's doing well now. She paints murals for businesses in the area. I didn't directly experience the creepiness, but I do get a little weirded out when I see any of the work she's done. This particular close encounter of mine occurred sometime in 2005. I was somewhere between 11 and 12 years old. My mom had just moved back to her hometown of Kuskia, Idaho, a tiny town with a population of approximately 654. She came across a little cafe called the Idaho Backroads that had a for sale sign in the window. She wandered in and discovered the place was still owned by friends of hers from years back. They were an older couple who were approaching retirement age. They were eager to sell, and soon enough, my mom was the proud owner of a quaint little cafe. We spruced the place up. It had minor wear and tear that the older people couldn't routinely take care of, and reopened in the summer of 2005. It was a mom-and-pop sort of place called the Idaho Backroads Cafe, located in a small town on the Snake River called Kooskia, Idaho. Kooskia is pretty much the last stop on Highway 95 if you're heading out to Missoula, Montana. There are a few tiny towns in between, but Kooskia tends to get a lot of tourism in the spring and summer months. When my mother bought the back roads, we often encountered touring elderly people, families, lone travelers, and bikers. Our food was reasonably priced, and to several customers, it tasted like home. Well, the cafe was our home, as we had a tiny apartment in the back in which we all lived. My older sister, Talia, lived with my mother full-time at 16. My sister Shauna and I lived with our father during the school year until our mom could find a better place to live that suited 3 girls. We were excited to work and live in our restaurant. Yes, all of us worked at that little cafe, as my mother could only run the restaurant and pay bills, not hire a full-time staff. Like I said, Kooskia was a tiny town, and once tourism left, we scraped by until the next season. As a 12-year-old girl might believe, it was great waiting tables. It actually was. At the time, I was a small blonde girl with gangly limbs and a quick smile. This kept the tips flowing, as elderly people find children irresistible and were incredibly generous. I saved my tips for various things a child wants, but mainly I stashed the money away to help pay for school supplies. My mother raised us to take care of ourselves, and that earning your own money for things you wanted was rewarding. Our little apartment in the back was one open room, with 2 doors on opposite walls from each other and no windows. A narrow hallway led to a laundry room of sorts, with a stackable washer and dryer, 2 huge freezers, and a linen cupboard. Another section was a ridiculously small bathroom painted Pepto pink, if I remember correctly. Next was the storage room, with our business/family computer, Windows 98 gateway, smiley face, our bigger fridge, and a sort of walk-in freezer. Then, one small step away and you were in the kitchen of our eatery. Out back was a gated pen in which we kept our family dog during restaurant hours. Reggie was just growing out of her puppy stage, with her 2 big ears and gangly legs. She was a mix of wolf and German shepherd and was starting to grow into all the muscle of the shepherd while maintaining the look of a wolf. She was a pretty thing, all white, save for a patch of red that ran along her back and tail. She was bought for my older sister, but being a grand majority of wolf, she regarded us all as her pack. One particular day, midsummer, we were all diligently working away when a man came into the restaurant. My sister, Shauna, seated him in a booth and took off to grab a menu, water, and his cutlery. I was working that day as well, and something seemed a little off about this gentleman. All I remember about him is dark, shaggy hair, his slumped posture, and more than a week's growth of uneven beard. She set his things down, politely smiled, and said she would be back in a jiff to take his order. My mother, who happened to be standing at the till, was eyeing this stranger with an unsettling intensity. My mom, in all the things she's done in her life, was a correctional officer at a prison for a number of years. She instinctively knew how to spot trouble. She was very wary. As I walked by with an armful of dirty dishes, she squeezed my shoulder and told me to take a break. We weren't particularly busy at the time, but it was quite odd of her to ask me to take a break so early in the day. I started to politely protest, but she squeezed my shoulder a little harder this time and looked me in the eyes with that "don't argue" child look that you just don't argue with. So I shrugged, dropped my dishes off with Jasper, our dishwasher, hung up my apron, and went outside to check on Reggie. When I walked outside, I left the back door open, like I always do. She sat by the gate, fully at attention, with an anxious look in her eyes. I reached out to scratch her ears, which she normally loves, but today she took this almost stoically, looking past me and into the apartment like she wanted to come inside. I could not do that during business hours, unless it was raining, and we put up a baby gate on the threshold of the kitchen to keep her from trotting around. I talked to her for a minute or two and turned to go back inside. She let out a whimpering growl and tried to hop the chain-link gate after me. I shushed her and told her to stay put, and she reluctantly obeyed the command. Being a clever dog, she would have opened the gate herself. But since she had done this in the past, we had clipped a chain around the gate latch with a padlock, and even if she was intelligent, she didn't have thumbs to turn a key. I closed the door, and she let out a pained howl, like she needed to come with me. I did not wish to anger my mother by letting Reggie roam free in our eatery, so I firmly closed the door and made my way outside. 15 minutes was long enough of a break, and it was nearing noon. The lunch rush was coming. As I approached the kitchen, I heard a commotion. I froze on the threshold, in mid-stride. Jasper had his back to me and looked extremely tense. This was completely abnormal, as he was the sort of laid-back person who was incredibly relaxed. I glanced around him and saw the man from earlier standing in the middle of the seating area, screaming at my sister. He was red-faced and completely belligerent, waving his hands threateningly, spit flying everywhere, as he loomed over my 13-year-old sister. In a flash, my mom was between them, losing her calm, establishment owner demeanor. She had seamlessly replaced this look with the stance of an angry mother bear. Jasper and our older sibling Talia joined her as well, creating a wall of flesh to shield Shauna from danger. I watched, terrified, in silence. Talia, an intimidating 16-year-old, often sparred with our mother and her fellow officers for defense training practice. She also played a variety of sports, and despite her short stature, she was pure muscle. The man continued screaming, making absolutely no sense about what he was so angry about. Quickly, my mother subdued the gentleman, twisting his arm behind his back and marching him outside, pushing him across the street to the gas station parking lot. He took a swing at her when she let go of his arm, and she subdued him yet again. I was scared for this man, belligerent as he was, for even attempting to hurt my mom. If she lost her temper with him, things could get deadly. She didn't tolerate threats towards her children. He waved his hands in surrender, storming off down the street. I scampered away to the apartment before she spotted me, and quickly turned on the television, pretending to still be on my break. She came in, looking incredibly calm. She scanned the apartment reflexively, her danger instincts still on high alert. "Lissa, we're closing for the afternoon. Come help break down." This was a command, not from my boss, but from my mother. These were two different people. I jumped up immediately and came out. Talia and Jasper stood together, looking ashen and drawn. Shauna was just barely calm from her hysterics. This is not easy for her. She doesn't have the same temperament as my mother, Talia, and me. She's a very timid individual. We turned the signs, cleaned the grills, set up for dinner, and my mom hung a sign on the door saying out until 5 p.m. Everyone went about their jobs in silence, except for the radio playing. It was an eerie calm. Mom sat in the corner booth with my sister, whose sobs had died down to hiccups, as she explained the situation. It turns out she had gone to take his order and hadn't heard something he'd said. She politely asked him to repeat himself. He just went ballistic from there, pushing her with such force she nearly fell, then stood there screeching at her. We all calmed ourselves eventually and reopened at 5 that night. Business resumed as usual until around dusk. I saw him stalking down the street again. In this town, you can see the whole stretch of Main Street from beginning to end. I tugged on my mother's sleeve as she walked by me, and she turned to look out the window where I pointed. She stiffened as he approached the building. He didn't come in, he simply walked by. But he turned around immediately as my sister came by and looked at her. She froze and stared. His drawn, hungry face stared right at her, and he leered. He drew a filthy finger across his throat, with a significant gesture at my sister. My mother called the police immediately. The deputy, Carlos, responded, as he knew my mother well. They carted the man away, but since there were no proper holding cells in town, they had to let him go with a warning. If he came near our family or restaurant, he would be taken to jail. We didn't see him again for the remainder of business hours and soon let it go. Things happened sometimes, and we figured he'd be gone. Night fell, and we went about our business with cleaning up and shutting down shop. At night, before we went to bed, one of us always had to take the dog on patrol, as we called it. We would walk with Reggie through the entire restaurant, opening every door so she could check. And I mean it when I say she insisted on checking out everything. We'd start in the apartment and work our way out, opening doors for her so she could inspect. Tonight, it was my turn, so I followed behind her as she checked under every table and booth, in the bathroom stalls, hallways, and the entire front lobby of the establishment. When she was satisfied with her inspection, she'd lay by the door to the apartment, and we'd reward her effort with a piece of deli meat or the occasional hamburger patty if we had one left over. Then she'd pad off to the apartment and resume normal dog activity. We all went to bed around 10:30 to 11 p.m. that night. My mom and I shared a bed, while Talia had her own, and Shauna slept on the pull-out couch. During the summer, we left the doors open and latched the screen door, one at the top and one at the bottom. The top was a hook, and the bottom was a slide latch. As I mentioned earlier, Reggie was a very clever dog and could figure out how to work things fast, so we doubled up on latches to prevent her from roaming at night. We all quickly went to sleep, as we generally woke at 4:30 in the morning to start prepping for breakfast when we opened at 5 a.m. Also, my mother was on Ambien for her sleeping issues, and she slept like a rock. Everything was fine, but I woke a couple of times to Reggie letting out a hair-raising low growl of warning. I figured a cat was outside, and she did not get along with them, so she was scaring them away from our door. I went back to sleep. What seemed to me like just minutes later, I jolted out of bed to find Reggie standing in the middle of the room, her fur standing on end. I got up just as my older sister rose from her bed to inspect the problem. It was hard to see, as the back alley had no streetlights, and the room was dark. Talia took a step away from her bed, and Reggie went ballistic. I sat watching from my bed, confused. Reggie let out a snarl that chills me to this day, her fangs bared. I had never seen Reggie act this way before. She was always docile and gentle. Talia calmly approached her and whispered, "Reggie, what is the matter with you?" in a hushed voice. By this time, my mother and other sister were stirring, and Mom was fighting her Ambien to wake. As soon as Talia said something, I heard a man curse under his breath, shoot, as if frustrated by the progress of something. Reggie no longer held back and flew into what I can only describe as the scariest thing I've ever seen in my 20 years of life, lunging full bore at the screen door. She barked ferociously, snarling, and making noises that sounded like someone had unleashed Cerberus the hellhound in our living space. She tore through the screen in her rage, forcing her upper half through the mesh as if it were paper. Now I heard him clearly, cursing and screaming at our dog. Everyone was awake, scrambling for lights, and yelling at each other in confusion. Reggie was caught by the midsection in the screen and struggled so hard to break free that she knocked one of the hinges loose. I heard a snapping noise, like a bear trap on bone, and the man screamed. This set our docile family pet into a frothing frenzy. She would have attacked him, even if she had to drag the whole door with her to get him. I heard something drop and the man cursing as he struggled to break free from the jaws of the fierce beast that was our Reggie. My mother reached the door in slow motion, kicking it open and simultaneously cocking her pistol and taking aim. Somehow, she managed to grab Reggie's collar, yank her back, and pass her off to my sister, who dragged her into the hallway and locked the door. I heard Reggie's outraged howl immediately after Talia locked her in, and it both frightened and comforted me at the same time. The man was gone into the black of the night, and Mom closed both apartment doors, locking them. She proceeded to the front of the cafe to call the police. In the morning light, we inspected the door's damage. The man from earlier in the day had come back for his revenge and was wielding an intimidating-looking knife. In his struggle with Reggie, he had dropped it on the welcome mat. He had been trying to jimmy the pin from the screen's hinges out of the hinging mechanism, and that sound was what alerted the dog. The police canvassed the neighborhood in the early light and found a trail of blood from our back door heading a couple of blocks west until it slowly grew faint. The police speculated that the man was in a crouching position when Reggie burst through the screen door and had probably been bitten in the shoulder or arm. They kept a watch out for our would-be attacker, but they never found him. If we hadn't had her, I'm sure we wouldn't be alive today. Sadly, when my sister married, she took Reggie with her to live out of town. She got out one day, and a hunter mistook her for an actual wild wolf and shot her illegally. She was one of the best dogs we've ever had, and I owe her my life. I only wish she could have lived a happy, full life she deserved and got to watch over my niece and nephews. Rest in peace, Regina. We love you. Years ago, I traveled to the Central American country of Guatemala quite frequently. I owned a small import business and would visit various local markets to select and purchase Maya artwork, ceramics, and woodworks for shipment back to the States. After taking care of my business obligations, I would often stay for another couple of weeks, exploring the countryside and visiting more remote locales. Guatemala is truly a beautiful country, full of active volcanoes, mountains, stunning vistas, vast rainforests, ancient Mayan ruins, and old Spanish colonial towns. To add to this mix, a significant portion of the population is Maya Indians, who still maintain some of their rich and colorful cultural heritage. Unfortunately, it also has its share of extreme poverty, shady characters, and desperate situations. I have many fond memories of my time in Central America, but one memory stands out as not so pleasant. On one trip, I believe it was December 1991, I decided to travel to the northern part of the country, to a region known as the Petén. It's a very remote area, covering over a third of the country, with a relatively small population until recently. It's primarily covered in lowlands of tropical rainforest and is filled with remnants of the ancient Maya civilization. Tikal is one of the most famous ruins in the region, but there are literally thousands scattered throughout the forest, many still undiscovered beneath the thick canopy and dense undergrowth. To me, this area was and still is a magical and mysterious place, ripe for adventure and discovery. I decided on a hike that would take me to the ruins of El Mirador, near the southern Mexican border. It's one of the largest Mayan ruins, and at the time, was mostly unexplored. I made my way to the small village of Carmelita, where I could hire a guide who knew the jungle trails, and mules to carry our gear for the approximately 75-mile round trip. We set out. The hiking was steady but leisurely, allowing us to take in the pristine environment and prolific wildlife. Though it was the dry season, it was still very hot and humid. Late on the second day of our trek north, we came upon a small group of 6 disheveled, hard-looking men who had set up what appeared to be a very temporary encampment. My guide, Carlos, was clearly surprised to see them, and the men didn't seem so happy about our intrusion. This was not an expected encounter. The camp consisted of a few blue tarps and supplies, along with their horses, and, I might add, a pretty good selection of firearms. I had read that this area was occasionally known to harbor a motley collection of drug runners, illegal loggers, and looters digging in the ruins for priceless Mayan artifacts to sell on the black market. So naturally, I was concerned. Here I was, miles and days away from any settlement, a lone foreigner among possible cutthroats and desperados. Carlos initiated a rapid flow of conversational Spanish, of which I could only partially understand. The gist of the dialogue was that we wanted no trouble and that I was an important person, not true, which would cause problems for them if I were harmed, kidnapped, or robbed. The tension was thick. The men were agitated, sizing us up with cold eyes and sneers as several grabbed their rifles and machetes. They told us in hostile terms to move on. We were more than happy to do so, but the day was late and it was already getting dark. We turned on our flashlights and continued for several hours into the night. Carlos didn't know these men and had never seen them before. He was clearly worried and upset. At the time, my Spanish wasn't great, but I understood enough to gather that our trip to the ancient ruins of El Mirador was over. Carlos believed these were bad people with bad intentions and suspected we were being followed. We might be robbed of our provisions and his meals, or worse, harmed. I can't begin to explain the terror of that night. Never had I been so scared. We left the trail and ventured maybe a mile deeper into the jungle, where we cut out a small clearing and set up our hammocks. Carlos took the mules farther into the jungle so they wouldn't give away our position. We didn't sleep that night. We sat up, listening, whispering, and taking small comfort in our shared terror. Every sound transformed into the imagined footsteps of someone creeping closer in the darkness and stifling humidity. Carlos cradled an antique pistol in his palm, not much of a defense against 6 men armed with automatic rifles and machetes. We started moving again before dawn. Carlos said we would have to cut through the forest and stay off the trail until we got closer to his village of Carmelita. The hike was intense and nerve-wracking, but at least we were heading towards safety. We didn't stop, we didn't eat, and we kept moving until we reached a small clearing and homestead. It was the home of a family Carlos knew, and we spent the night there. Carlos and his friend discussed the incident throughout the night, speculating on who the men might have been and whether they had tried to follow us. Both of them remained vigilant while I curled up in my hammock, surrounded by his 4 curious children, completely exhausted from the forced march, with frayed nerves and an empty stomach. I couldn't eat, my stomach was in knots. We never knew if they tried to follow us, but the next day, we finally reached the safety of Carmelita. My first adventure in that part of the Pettin came to a favorable end. Lost freshman. I'm still shaken up. This just happened to my friend Aaron and me this afternoon. Usually, stories like this take place in a dark alley or in the creepy setting of some deserted place, but no, not this time. I don't even feel safe anymore. I just moved to college. I'm 8 hours away from home. I'm sitting in my dorm room, still shaking. I want to cry. For heaven's sake, I've only been on campus for 5 days. Okay, sorry for the rant. I'm just in shock. Today, my friend Aaron and I had some downtime, so we decided to explore the campus and find all of our classes for the coming Monday, our official first day of classes, so we would know where they were. It was around 1900, but not dark. The sun was getting low in the sky, but it was a nice evening. People were out walking, and construction workers were still working because it was so cool, which is really unusual for an August day in the rural American South. Aaron and I went to map out his schedule. He's a computer science engineering major, so we had to go to this huge chemistry building to find his lecture hall. The first building we went to was a failed attempt. It was the wrong place. We walked across the street to another building, which opened into this huge auditorium-looking place. It was dead inside, probably because it was 1,900 during the summer, but it was still unlocked. It was eerily silent inside, too quiet. Aaron and I walked around, looking for someone to help us find his chemistry class. There was a guy in a janitor's uniform sitting near the rear exit. When he saw us come in, he stiffened. He sat bolt upright, eyes wide, and came toward us with rigid movements. I looked at Aaron, freaking out, but he was oblivious. He proceeded to ask the guy if he knew where the appropriate building was, and the janitor told him, eyes still wide as saucers. He spoke in a thick accent that made it hard for me to understand him. As he told Aaron where the building was, I saw the door behind the janitor slowly creep open. It made no sound, but I saw another guy in a janitor uniform standing in a crowded utility closet. I nearly lost it. I still don't know why he was in there, but Aaron saw him, and that was enough for him. We quickly thanked the guy and left. We followed the man's instructions because they were leading us in the right direction. We saw the huge chemistry building, took a left, expecting to go to the entrance, but were instead directed into a shady-looking back lot that seemed very much out of the way. That's when I heard a heavy voice about 50 yards to my left. "You lost?" A third guy in a janitor's uniform was leaning against a dumpster, smoking calmly. I suddenly realized we were cut off from civilization. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy and quick, coming down the walkway. I pulled Aaron with me, and we scrambled for anywhere we could find. We ran to the doors and pulled on each of them. They were all locked. I was frantic. Finally, we climbed a flight of stairs and found an open entrance to the basement of some unnamed building. From there, we called campus security, told them about the janitors, and were horrified to find out that, of course, there were no janitors. The building had been closed all summer due to damage sustained the previous year. It had been empty for a long time. I used to think things like this didn't happen. I mean, yeah, but it was broad daylight. We were minding our own business. Those men sent us there to, I guess, rob us? Harm us? I don't know. I just want to go home now. I don't feel safe here anymore. Don't talk to strangers, no matter how old you are. I was about 14 at the time. In fact, it all started a few months after my 14th birthday. I was really good friends with this girl I met during 7th grade. When we met, we instantly clicked. We pretty much had the same interests in everything, and there wasn't really a friend to best friend stage. It just jumped from not knowing each other to being best friends. Anyway, during that time, I realized that my friend was a big fan of a famous singer. The reason I say famous is because he was known but not extremely well known. He usually had small shows around where he lived and in the surrounding states, with only about 100 or so people attending his concerts. I was pretty excited when I heard that she knew who he was, and I explained to her that I had already met him 3 different times. He was a really chill dude, and he actually communicated with his fans, unlike most singers today, who usually just give a nod or a wave and leave. In fact, at the end of his shows, you could usually just walk up and talk to him for a few minutes at the back of the building. Just like any fangirl, she immediately asked me if I could take her to meet him. I told her that the next time he came to our state, I'd see what I could do. I want to explain something quickly. I do not know this singer personally. We aren't friends, and I don't have his phone number, street address, email, or anything that allows me to contact him directly. My boyfriend at the time was in a band and would often play shows throughout the state. Anyway, him being in a band gave him some advantages. He got to meet a lot of really famous bands and singers. Since I was his girlfriend at the time, I would often go to his shows and meet the other bands after the concert. That's the only reason I got to meet this singer that many times. 3 months went by, and my friend came running up to me, telling me that the singer was going to be playing in my state in 3 weeks and that we needed to get tickets immediately. So I got the tickets the same day, which was pretty easy considering he still wasn't well known and my boyfriend could help me out. Eventually, though, I started to realize that my friend was growing obsessed with him. I didn't really think much of it then. I just thought it was normal for any teenage girl, so I shrugged it off. It did get annoying at the time, though, because she would always talk about him. And when I say always, I mean it. She would somehow manage to get him into the conversation even when what we were talking about had absolutely nothing to do with him. I'd understand if his name came up when we were talking about music, but his name would come up even when I was talking about my family, friends, or what we were going to do that weekend. It was crazy. Fast forward 3 weeks, and it was the day of the concert. I apologize for all the time skips, but I don't want to bore you with unnecessary details. The plan was that she would come over to my house, my parents would drive us to the concert, drop us off, and pick us up 30 minutes after the concert ended so we'd have enough time to say hi and talk to him. The concert was amazing, just as I expected, and everyone flooded out of the doors, most not even stopping to meet him. As my friend and I approached him, she was spazzing out, jumping up and down, squealing, pretty much everything crazy fangirls do. He was outside the building with the rest of his band members. He was in a band, but she just liked him, the lead singer, smoking a cigarette. He was and still is a really attractive guy. He had really long hair, probably 5 or 6 inches past his shoulders. I could never tell if his hair was really dark brown or just black. He wasn't very tall, maybe 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, but it suited him. He immediately acknowledged us. In fact, he actually remembered who I was and asked about my boyfriend. They had hung out a couple of times. I talked to him for about a minute or so until my friend started spewing stuff at him. I can't remember everything she said, but I know most of it was pretty nasty, like all the things she wanted to do with him, that she was in love with him, and that she wanted to have his babies. Being the kind of guy he was, he just awkwardly laughed it off. I could tell he was uncomfortable by the way he held himself and his body language. I tried to make my friend quiet down a few times, but she just waved me off and told me she knew what she was doing. She then started to scream at him that he had to marry her, or she would commit suicide that night and that they were soulmates. At this point, he wasn't really saying anything, but he didn't walk away either. He just kind of stood there. But when he didn't reply to her demands of marriage, she flipped out even more and started hysterically crying. At that point, I knew I needed to take her away from him, and quickly. She was bent down and hiding her face. I attempted to grab her arm and pull her away from him, but she yanked her arm away, sprinted towards him. I swear I have never seen someone move that fast, and somehow managed to pull some of his hair out. It wasn't a large amount that left a bald spot on his head, but it was a good chunk. She then shoved it into her jeans pocket and started to walk away. After that, I swore I was going to have a heart attack. Honestly, at that moment, I don't think either he or I really knew what had happened. I was really flustered, and at some point, I remember crying because I was scared. Interestingly enough, he didn't call the cops. I found it hard to believe he didn't, given the situation. I probably apologized to him a billion times before I left to find my friend, but still to this day, I sincerely feel bad for what she did to him. Oh, but that wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the beginning. The drive home was extremely awkward, and during that time, I refused to talk to her because of how upset I was. But a few days later, after my intense anger had faded, we started to talk again. She wouldn't stop texting and calling me, so I gave in. Shortly after the incident, she started to explain how she would see him all the time and how she believed he was stalking her. She would tell me how he would come to her in her dreams and tell her that he loved her so much and that they were meant to be together. Sometimes, she would even tell me that he would sneak into her room late at night and sleep with her, I don't know what she meant by sleep, and I never really needed or wanted to know, and then tell her how they were going to get married. I didn't tell her at the time, but he had actually left my state the day after the concert, so there was no physical way he could have done all the things she said he was doing. But I let her talk. I didn't want to tell her he was gone because I was scared of what she might do. Actually, during that time, I was doubting my friendship with her, but I continued to stay her friend. That was until about a week and a half later. I was at her house to spend the night. She was in the bathroom taking a shower and getting ready because we were about to go out for the night. I was in her room, sprawled across her bed, when I had the sudden urge to look up at the ceiling. I couldn't help but panic when I looked up and saw that her entire ceiling was covered in hundreds of pictures of the singer. I really didn't want to be at her house anymore, so I quietly repacked my bags so she wouldn't hear me. Unfortunately, she got out of the shower before I could leave. She came into her bedroom and saw me holding my bags. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The weirdest thing was that she had the hair she pulled out of the singer's head attached to her own hair with a hair tie. At that point, I felt like I needed to get out of the house. We were home alone, and I was terrified. She was bigger and stronger than me, so I had a difficult time getting her off when she lunged at me and wrapped her hands around my throat. While she was on top of me, she screamed that I couldn't take him away from her, that he was hers, and that if I didn't take her to see him again, she was going to kill me. I honestly don't know how I got out of this situation, but I do remember immediately telling my parents about the incident, and not long after, the police got involved. My friendship with her ended after that. I switched phone numbers, and about 6 months later, I switched schools because I moved. I don't know what happened to her, to be honest, whether she got arrested or sent to a mental institute or what. I sincerely don't want to know. But I do feel like there was something wrong with her and that she needed help. If anyone has any questions about anything involving the story, please feel free to ask. I do want to say that I don't feel comfortable telling you the name of the band or the singer involved since I don't think it's right for me to do so. My dog had better instincts than I did. Before I left for college, I lived with my mom and stepdad on a huge non-operational farm in the thumb of Michigan, right on Lake Huron. The estate had a 4-bedroom manor built in the 1800s, a groundskeeper hut, a large warehouse-type barn, another building that housed cattle, and 2 smaller sheds we used for outdoor storage. The barns were neglected, structurally sound, but with all the makings of creepy buildings, crackling white paint on the inside, old artifacts from when the farm was operational, and so on. The house itself looked just like the one from the Amityville horror series, while the interior resembled the house from the others. Imagine that. The entire estate sat on about 15 acres, with the house and barns on a plot of land roughly the size of 3 football fields. Behind the house was a thick forest that surrounded the property. In front of the house was a dirt road, another smaller forest, and then the shoreline to the lake. We had no neighbors and were the only property within a 4-mile radius. When I was about 16, my parents went across the country for a wedding, leaving me alone in the house for the weekend. I was fairly responsible, and the town I lived in was tiny, about 1,500 residents total, and incredibly safe, so there wasn't any real concern. Our family dog, a giant purebred Siberian husky named Sheba, was always around. I was used to being home alone and usually relished the privacy, but after that Saturday, I refused to ever stay alone again. Most of the day on Saturday, I spent at my friend Leanne's house. Around 2000, I decided to head home and make myself some dinner. The kitchen was toward the back of the house, with a large double window facing one of the barns and the old caretaker's house. Sheba was outside, lying in the yard and enjoying the summer night air. I had most of the lights off inside, and there were no lights outside since we were so isolated. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of noodles, when I saw something flicker in my peripheral vision. I walked over to the window, and sure enough, I saw what looked like the faint glow of a lantern or something coming from the tiny window of the caretaker's hut. I wasn't sure what to think. I dismissed it as kids exploring, but nonetheless, I grabbed a flashlight and Sheba and walked out to the hut. I opened the door, and there was one of those giant floodlights turned on, just lying on the floor. I brushed it off as something that had fallen from a shelf and turned on by itself. It's a little less than a quarter-mile walk from the caretaker's hut to my house, which stood on a mound at the front of the estate. I stood outside the hut's door, petting Sheba and throwing rocks into the creek that ran through the yard. The stove was off, and the night air felt nice, so I wasn't in a hurry. I was crouched down, playing with my dog, when I saw something I'll never, ever forget. The kitchen light in the house came on. Then the bathroom light came on. Then, as if someone were walking up the stairs, I saw the hallway light turn on, followed by the 2 bedroom lights that faced my direction. What the heck? I knew I had to go inside and check it out, but that wasn't what I particularly wanted to do at the moment. My phone was in the house charging. At that point, I did what any other 16-year-old would do. I walked into the barn, grabbed an old farmer's scythe from the wall, and slowly walked up to the house with Sheba by my side. Before I went anywhere near the door, I decided that someone was either robbing us, or one of my friends who knew I'd be home alone was messing with me. Either way, I wanted to take control of the situation. The circuit breaker for the entire house was located in the barn next to it. I cut the power, grabbed my dog, weapon, and flashlight, and walked into the house. Sheba instantly bolted from the kitchen into the lower part of the house, checking things out. I waited a couple of minutes for her. She started barking loudly and then growling. I heard some weird shifting noises, which I blamed on the dog. I was about to start walking through the house when Sheba came running back into the kitchen, bolting past me and knocking open the loose screen door as she ran off into the night. Again, my 16-year-old fearless mind thought she just caught the scent of a fox or something and ran off after it. I wasn't really worried, as she would run off all the time and come back 15 minutes later. We had 15 acres for her to explore. I checked out the lower part of the house, which wasn't too bad considering I was used to the creaking. The old parlor room was our living room, and it had giant floor-to-ceiling windows. I was staring out at them, looking for who knows what when I heard a crash upstairs. You know that moment when you think you see or hear something scary, and you just play it off? That's how I felt right before I heard the crash. I decided I'd looked for enough trouble that night, grabbed my phone, and ran outside. I was walking down the end of my driveway, about to open the door to my Jeep, when all the lights in my house came back on. Someone had turned the circuit breaker back on in the shed, which was on the other side of the house from where I was. Then, from across the estate, I saw all of the buildings light up. Someone had turned on the breakers for the entire property. At this point, I should have called the cops, but a part of me held back, wanting to find whoever was messing with me. I ran as fast as I could, crazy scythe in hand, over to the barn with the breaker box. Nobody was there. The only thing out of place was that my stepdad's mini fridge, which he kept out there when he was working, was wide open. I closed the fridge door. I called Leanne, told her what was going on, and started to walk back to the house when I saw whatever had been messing with me. A tall figure was just standing in the middle of our circular driveway, looking at me. I yelled, "What the heck?" at them and ran toward whoever it was, and they took off across the street into the woods on the other side of the house. It was so dark that I couldn't really tell what they were wearing. It was definitely a person, and they were tall and lanky. Leanne told me she was coming over, and at this point, I guess I didn't need to call the cops since the person had fled. She got there, and we both went upstairs to see what was going on. Only 3 things were out of place, but they were enough to leave us in a really unsettled mood. My mom used one of the rooms as a guest room, which also housed all of her ceramic dolls. She had them displayed all around the room. There were about 40 dolls in total. All of the dolls had been moved close to the bed, with each doll's gaze pointed straight at the bed. On the bed itself were 2 dolls placed in a crude sexual position. The upstairs bathroom had one of those old-fashioned deep tubs. The shower curtain had been pulled off the rings, and there was water and a shampoo bottle in the tub. A doll was lying on the floor with wet, soapy hair, as if someone had started washing the doll's hair and then left. The last and probably creepiest thing we saw, someone had taken a doll and hung it from the ceiling lamp in my bedroom using some of my ties that were tied together. I also had photographs taped to my bedroom wall of my friends, and they had all been torn down. I wish I had snapped some pictures with my phone, but in the midst of everything going on, that was the last thing I wanted to do. After securing the house and locking all the doors, Leanne and I called the cops. The officer, who I knew personally, small town, checked the immediate property and the house. Since nothing was really damaged and the person wasn't around anymore, he just offered to patrol the house every hour or so and to check up on me. I decided to sleep over at Leanne's house for the next few days. I never told my parents what happened since I didn't want to scare them. I came back every afternoon to see if my dog had returned and to leave food and water out for her, but nothing. Sheba came back 4 days after she ran off, which is the longest she's ever been gone. The incident didn't really traumatize me as much as you'd think, but I did watch my step around the house at night and viewed my small town differently. The person never came back to my knowledge. There were some nights, however, when I'd be lying in bed in the middle of the night and hear Sheba start growling. I always tried to brush it off. I kept the door to the guest room closed at all times and never wanted to see a ceramic doll again. I haven't been back to the house since 2008, and my mom no longer lives there, but she did say that in the month before they relocated, several lawn gnomes she had decorated her garden with were moved to face the front door, all staring at it. Ridiculous, but true. Holes in my slacks. I can't remember why I needed to go to the store. There's a lot I don't remember about 1994, so take this story with a grain of salt. It was well after dark, but along with my uncle, I was cleaning and sorting through the apartment I had once shared with my mother. 2 days earlier, she had died after a long, brutal struggle with breast cancer. Now, her brother and I were hauling away her things and picking out the few of mine that would fit in a suitcase. In less than a week, I would be living in a state 1,000 miles from my own with family I barely knew. As I left the building, I was dressed for hard work in a ratty t-shirt and faded jeans so full of holes that they revealed much of my skin with each step. We lived in a rough New York neighborhood, and normally, I dressed for it in baggy clothes that hid my body. That night, I could have been sleepwalking for all I was aware of my surroundings. I made the trip without incident, and once home, resumed working. Then the phone rang. As my uncle worked in another room, I answered, and a high-pitched voice, sounding bashful, almost boy-like, asked, "Did you get everything you needed at the grocery?" "Who is this?" I replied. The voice ignored my question and began to giggle excitedly, like a little kid making a prank call. "Is this Seth?" I asked. Seth and I were in the same 8th grade class, and a few weeks earlier, we'd gone to the movies together. It was my first date, except I wouldn't let him call it one or do more than hold my hand. The voice explained that no, it wasn't Seth, but it was someone who knew me, even though I didn't know him. He was watching out for me. He saw me at the store and liked what he saw. He liked it a lot, but clearly, I needed some new pants. "You need some new clothes. You got too many holes in your slacks," he said. Something was very wrong, and it was all there in that one word, slacks, too old-fashioned and spoken too eagerly, like a man smacking his lips on a juicy apple. Using the same logic that had served me so poorly during Mom's illness, I decided that as long as I pretended everything was fine, reality would contort itself accordingly. Instead of calling for my uncle or just hanging up, I stood there in the hall with the phone to my ear, listening to the boy talk in a whisper about everything he saw and everything he was going to see, while I babbled back with increasing panic, "Seth, stop kidding around. Maybe you thought this would make me laugh, but it's not funny, Seth. Please stop." I'd begun to shake, and it was audible in my voice. "This isn't Seth." Instantly, I was so frightened that my vision tunneled to a point, as if I stood outside myself, watching a pale girl on the phone in a dark hall, a stranger talking to a stranger. No amount of denial could disguise that as the voice rose to a shout from a whisper, it darkened all the way down to the bass registers. Seth's voice had yet to change. The pale girl wasn't talking to a boy, she was talking to a man so consumed with rage that he sounded nearly possessed by it. The man spoke again. Now he sounded calm, even happy. "You're ready. I know you are, Laura. You showed me that tonight." He laughed at my silence, then said something I can't recall, no matter how long I sit here thinking about it. Whatever it was, it set my feet walking toward the handset, where I laid down the phone and paused. When it didn't ring again, I walked into my mother's room and, without a word to my uncle, resumed throwing away all the pieces of her life that no one wanted anymore. Within a week, I was on a plane to my new home, but it took years to remember what happened, and I've given up on understanding it. I'll never know if the man who called me would have made good on his threats. I'll never even know who he was. What I do have is the strangest and coldest possible comfort. Like all good mothers, mine devoted much of her life to protecting her child from harm. I missed that protection bitterly once it was gone, but by dying when she did, my mother may just have saved my life. The nearest motel? To start out, there needs to be a bit of backstory. After graduation, I had to move back to my small hometown with my parents. This city has never been a place where you could feel truly safe, and my neighborhood has never been considered one of the nicer ones. I grew up hearing stories and reading headlines about all the unpleasant things people do to each other so close to my bedroom. After a few years of exploring the city and never having anything more than wolf whistles threaten my well-being, I had grown compliant and trusting towards the mass of strangers I called neighbors. My parents have always been paranoid about home security, so even at 21, I don't have a house key. They're afraid I'll host wild parties or house transients while they're at work. I've spent many an afternoon parked in the driveway, seat fully reclined, feet out the window, headphones on high, with a Wi-Fi connected phone in my hand. If no one is home to open the door, I'm stuck there. I was supposed to have lunch with an old friend from high school, but she canceled last minute. That left me looking forward to at least 5 hours of driveway browsing while everyone I knew was working or out of town. About 3 hours in, I noticed a pickup truck pull up on the other side of the street. It wasn't someone with a key to my house, so I went back to killing zombies with vegetables. 15 minutes passed, and I got this really uneasy feeling. I finished up my level and glanced at my mirrors. I nearly jumped. A man was standing in my driveway, close enough to my trunk that he could have been tampering with my taillights. I let out a yelp and yanked my headphones out of my ears. He was gangly, well over 6 foot, with buzzed blonde hair, and had the creepiest smile I'd ever seen. I could tell by the pick marks and rotted teeth he was using more than just phonics, and he was flying pretty high for 3 p.m. on Wednesday. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, arms raised to show he didn't have anything in his hands. "Oh no, I was just startled. I really should be more observant. Is there anything I can help you with?" I was still shaking, but that was just the residual adrenaline. I didn't have any reason to be afraid of this guy. These little alarms going off in my head were just learned paranoia from too much Law and Order SVU. I'm sorry. He took a few steps closer to the driver's door. I just need directions to the nearest motel. I'm working in the area, but don't live here. I was still a bit flustered, but I gave a brief description of all the local inns and motels and gave him directions to the one he picked. It happened to be the closest one to my house, but I didn't really think about that. I'm not sure I'll be able to follow that. It's a bit complicated. Could I just follow you there? I'll pay you gas money for it. Now I'm really getting creeped out. He never dropped his smile, not even when he talked. No, thank you, I said, trying to let him know I'm done talking and that he should leave. It's really easy. 1 right and 2 lefts, it'll be on the left. You can't miss it. He was silent for a few seconds longer than normal, just staring. I was about to roll up my window when he blurted out, "Were you sleeping?" I was not prepared for this question, or really any question not related to directions or bed bugs. No. I was slightly embarrassed that some guy, clearly out of his mind, thought my behavior was weird, so I started scrambling for some excuse. I left my key and I'm just waiting for my mother to get home. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I remembered the big rule my dad used to tell me when I had to be in public by myself: never let them know you're alone. His smile somehow stretched, showing more rotted teeth and neglected gums. So a right and 2 lefts, he confirmed, head tilting to get a better look into my little car. I couldn't help but think he looked like a psychotic emoticon. It'll be on the left. I began to shrink back into my upholstery. I promise. Well, it doesn't sound very far. I guess if I can't find it, I can always come back for more help. He walked back to his truck and just sat there, staring out his window in my direction, that smile still in place. 20 minutes passed before he left. I decided that Mickey D's internet was just as good as my own and hunkered down in the parking lot until I got called home. 3 weeks passed, and I had forgotten about the strange man until I saw a vaguely familiar truck parked up my street. I drove by trying to figure out where I'd seen it before, and I saw him sitting in the driver's seat. That smile was still there. He waved, and I waved back. His car is back on the street tonight, but he isn't in it. Could time travel be a natural phenomenon? My experience in Washington's Cascade Mountains. I have always loved the outdoors. I was fortunate enough to be born in the Great Pacific Northwest, specifically in the western Washington Cascades. My father and I spent much of my early years exploring the mountains, fishing, and hunting. There are parts of the Cascades I know like the back of my hand. One of those places is called Goblin Creek, located up the Index-Galima Road off Highway 2. When I was a kid, we would drive up there to fish, shoot, and collect a specific type of rock that, when cut in half and polished, resembled a scenic picture of a mountain view from within a cave. I don't recall the true name of these stones, we just called them picture rocks. My father's friend and neighbor owned an art gallery mineral shop that used to be a church. If you've ever driven through Startup on your way from Sultan to Gold Bar on Highway 2, you might remember seeing the robot sculpture outside the shop that my dad built. This is the place where we sold the stones for $2 a pound. It was lucrative revenue for a preteen. The walk from the creek, where we harvested these rocks, to the dirt road wasn't particularly long, but it was long enough that one could get lost if they didn't know where to go. In the years we spent at this creek, I had only ever seen 2 other people out there. One was a game warden who heard the gunshots from our target practice and tracked us down to make sure everything was fine. The other is the subject of my curiosity. When I was about 14, I distinctly remember hauling a backpack full of these rocks up from the creek to my dad's truck. Along the way, I ran into a man who looked to be about 30 years old. We both seemed surprised to see anyone in this remote section of the mountains. As I got closer to this man, He was heading down to the creek, and I was heading up to the road. He seemed increasingly startled, as if he was seeing a ghost. He didn't say anything as I passed. He just stared at me, seemingly trying to figure out the right words to ask me something. After passing him, I remember thinking how much this guy looked like he could be in my family. The similarities were striking. I continued onto the truck, dumped my load of rocks off, and headed back down to the river to my dad. When I arrived, I told him about the encounter and asked if he had seen the man, to which he replied that he hadn't. I've remembered this encounter quite vividly since then. Last year, I was visiting my family in Snohomish and decided to head up to Old Goblin Creek for nostalgic purposes. It had been about 15 years since I was last up there. Along the way, I found out that the Index Galima Road had apparently washed out years before. Luckily, I knew another way up there via Jack Pass. I found the dirt road, parked where my dad used to park, and proceeded to walk through the woods down to the creek. Along the way, I saw something that absolutely shook me to the core. As I was about halfway through the woods, I was startled to see someone else coming up from the creek, a boy about 14 years old. He was wearing a backpack that looked to be burdened by heavy weights. As we got closer, I became increasingly confused and shocked as the boy looked exactly like I did at his age. I meant to say something to him as he passed, but I couldn't figure out the right words to express what I was thinking at that moment. He passed me and kept going. I walked a little farther and finally stopped when it all really hit me. I remembered the encounter from my teenage years and realized I had just lived the other half of the experience. Both the man and the boy were me, roughly 15 years apart. I turned around to catch up to the boy in the thick western Washington woods. I ran all the way back up to the road where my truck was to find nothing. There wasn't anywhere else besides the road for him to go, and I hadn't stalled long enough to not catch up to him. He was simply gone. Curiosity got the best of me, so I hurried down to the creek, half expecting to find my dad fishing on the bank 15 years younger, but I found nobody. I ended up going home and decided that this experience was too unbelievable to tell even my friends and family. I just wanted to get this out there to the wonderful Reddit community to see what others think and hopefully to see if anyone else has had this type of experience as well. The store and the stalker. I managed an art supply shop for a while, and during that time, I got to know one of my customers, Gregory. He was a large man in every sense of the word. He towered over the other customers, had wide shoulders, and while he wasn't in shape, he still had hands like bowling balls. Gregory worked as a city bus driver, but was planning to start a company in some South American country. He was taking an interest in crafts so he could take supplies and knowledge with him. For this, Gregory would come to classes. Usually, he would come alone, though sometimes he would bring his wife, a gorgeous woman also from South America. I thought they were a nice couple, friendly, and thought nothing more of it. Then, one day, Gregory came into the store. My employee on duty was busy behind the counter, and Gregory asked for my help looking at books. Our book section was in the back corner, the only section of the store, I might add, not visible from the front desk. I walked back and turned to ask him what he was looking for, and he pinned me to the wall. Again, this is a big man. He professed his love for me and told me that he would leave his wife if I said so, and that he would, that night, fly us both to South America to save me from being here. I laughed it off, somehow managing to get away, and Gregory left the store. A few days later, I was working at the front desk, which was near the window, and I heard some commotion outside. A city bus was sitting there. Now, we were on the bus route, but there was no reason for a bus to stop outside. Puzzled, I glanced at the driver. It was Gregory. He saw me looking and quickly drove off. Over the next few days, I'd see the same bus slow down outside. After looking up the bus route, I realized he was actually taking it a few blocks outside his run just to do this, bringing his unwilling passengers along for the ride. The next week, I was training a new employee. We were alone in the store when Gregory walked in, looking like hell. I saw him and, without thinking, ran out the back door, leaving a brand new employee confused and alone. I walked down to a nearby thrift shop and asked to hide in their back room for 15 minutes before calling the shop. My employee, sounding lost and panicked, told me that Gregory had left. When I got back, he had left a message for me. He had been fired from his job and his wife had left him. This meant there was nothing holding us apart. Soon afterward, Gregory took to just sitting outside the shop in his car, staring in the window at me. He'd be there sometimes at closing, and I started making sure I was never going out to my car alone. One night, after my staff had all left, I looked out and saw Gregory outside. Panicked, I asked a frequent customer to please stay, explaining that my stalker was outside. That customer was in to buy tattoo supplies. He was a member of a biker gang and an overall sweet guy. I told him the whole story, and concerned, he walked me out to my car that night. He then told me that the next time Gregory was outside, I was to give him a call. That weekend, I looked out and saw Gregory staring at me from his car. I grabbed my cell phone and called my biker friend. Half an hour later, there was the roar of engines outside. Easily 20 motorcycles pulled up, surrounding Gregory's car. Someone yanked open his door, and I saw heated words being exchanged. Gregory was talking animatedly with his hands, and no one looked happy. A second later, he tried to back up, but everyone got back on their motorcycles and followed him down the street. An hour later, my biker friend came in and told me I shouldn't expect any more trouble from Gregory. I baked him a few dozen cookies the next week as a thank you. Which, rough and tough image aside, no one says no to homemade cookies.